Hey you. Yes, you already curled up somewhere warm, blanket pulled up, maybe still scrolling on your phone before you talk yourself into finally putting it down. Thank you for choosing this instead. Tonight we're not going anywhere pretty. Get comfortable anyway, because where we're headed, comfort is going to matter more than you think. Here is something to sit with for a moment. If everything you own vanished by morning, your home, your income, every person willing to take you in, how many days do you honestly think you would survive out there completely alone, with nowhere left to turn for close to 1 million people in Victorian England? That was never a thought experiment. That was simply Tuesday, and the only answer available to them waited behind one particular door, a door that swallowed people whole, and rarely handed them back the way they walked in. Before we step through it together, I want to ask you for something small though, only if tonight earns it. If a story like this keeps you company, keeps your mind quietly turning long after you should be asleep, go ahead and tap that like button. It costs nothing, and it quietly helps more nights like this one find their way to more people just like you. And if you are new around here, consider staying a while and hitting subscribe so the next quiet story finds you too. Wherever you happen to be listening from, I am curious, honestly, where in the world are you tonight and what time is it there right now? Tell me in the comments. I read every single one, and there is something rather comforting about knowing exactly how many corners of the world are quietly awake with me at this very hour. Alright, let us get the room right. Dim the lights a little further if you can. Turn on a fan or a heat or something with a soft, steady hum sitting underneath everything. Settle in properly, because where we're going tonight does not wait patiently for anyone. It never did. It is the year 1854, somewhere on the outskirts of London, and the rain has not properly stopped in 3 days. You've been walking since before sunrise, your breath fogging in the cold, your shawl soaked through hours ago, your shoes long past pretending to keep the water out. Weeks earlier, you still had a roof a tray, maybe even a little pride left over at the end of each week. Then the work dried up the way it always seems to right before winter, and the landlord stopped pretending to be patient. You sold the good chair first, then the mirror. Then quietly on a morning you would rather forget your wedding ring, to a pawnbroker who did not so much as glance up while he weighed it. There is a strange kind of arithmetic to poverty, the way it strips a household down one object at a time until the only thing left to surrender is yourself. By the time most people reach this particular gate, they arrive holding almost nothing at all, which in a rather cruel twist was more or less the entire point of the system waiting on the other side of it. Ahead of you now, rising out of the fog, sits a wall of red brick taller than anything else on the street, broken only by narrow, deliberately small windows and one heavy iron gate. Above it, carved directly into the stone where nobody could possibly miss it, a single word: union. Every soul in the parish has learned to fear that word long before they ever needed to walk toward it. There is already a small queue waiting outside, huddled close for warmth that never quite arrives. An old man, a young woman holding a child too tired to cry anymore. Somewhere down the street a church bell marks an hour that no longer means very much to any of you. The air smells of wet wool coal smoke and something faintly sour that nobody bothers naming out loud. Near the front of the line, a man is turned away quietly, almost politely, because his parish of birth lies 2 counties over, and this particular union is not obligated to take him in. He does not argue. He simply picks up his bundle and walks back into the rain toward wherever the next gate might be. Nobody in the queue says anything about it. Nobody has to. You shift your weight from one foot to the other, and try one last time to think of anywhere else you might go instead. There is nowhere. There never really was. Eventually a hatch slides open in the door. A face appears on the other side, unbothered already halfway through a question he has clearly asked 1,000 times before yours. Name. You give it. He does not look up. Age. Parish of settlement. Reason for seeking relief. You answer each one as steadily as you can manage, though your voice catches slightly on the last question, the way it tends to when a stranger asks you to explain out loud exactly how you came to fail. He writes without really looking at you, and somewhere behind him a bell tolls the hour, marking a rhythm you have not yet learned, but soon will whether you want to or not. Here is a small strange detail worth knowing. This interview is not simply a formality, it is in its own bureaucratic way an interrogation. If you belong to the wrong parish, you can be turned away and told to walk toward a different union entirely, sometimes for days. The Victorians, as it turns out, were remarkably thorough when it came to paperwork and remarkably less thorough when it came to kindness. You pass. You are handed a paper ticket that does not feel like permission at all. It feels closer to a sentence. The gate closes behind you with a weight you did not expect, and before you have had even a moment to look around properly, you are separated. If you arrived with a husband, a wife, an aging parent, older children, they are led toward one door, you toward another. There is perhaps a single second where a small hand tightens around yours, refusing to let go before an attendant gently, firmly pries it loose. Nobody explains when or whether you will see them again. In some of the larger unions, buildings holding as many as 3,500 people under one roof, a husband and wife could live inside those same walls for years and pass one another only once a week. Across a chapel aisle, forbidden even to whisper a greeting. First, though, comes what they call the receiving ward. A holding room, really, where new arrivals wait sometimes for hours, sometimes overnight, kept apart from everyone already living inside. The bench is hard. The room is bare except for a single high window too small to climb through, and too grimy to see much beyond. This is not cruelty for its own sake, at least not entirely. Disease travelled fast in places this crowded, and nobody wanted a stranger's fever spreading through a dormitory of 300 sleeping strangers. So you wait, listening to the rain against that small window, cold damp, and increasingly aware that whoever you were this morning is about to be quietly taken apart piece by piece. Next, the bath. Cold water often shared among several people before anyone bothers changing it, taken under the direct watch of an attendant whose entire job is making sure you do it properly. There is no curtain here for modesty. Modesty, it turns out, was never something the parish felt particularly obligated to provide. Your hair is checked next carefully for lice, which were common enough among the desperate that nobody in the room even reacts. If needed, it is treated right there, sometimes cut short without much conversation about how you feel on the matter, and then quietly, almost gently, they take your clothes. Not thrown away, and that detail matters more than it sounds. Everything is folded, labelled with your name, and placed on a shelf where it will wait for you untouched for however long you remain. It is in its own strange bureaucratic way the one small mercy built into an otherwise merciless process, a quiet admission, buried somewhere in the paperwork that the parish never truly expected you to stay forever. Somebody somewhere still believed you might walk back out one day and need your old life again. In its place, you are given the uniform. Rough wool, coarse linen, cut for durability rather than comfort. Made from the exact same pattern as everyone else standing on your side of the room. If you are a woman, it is a plain shapeless dress, an apron, a simple cap for your hair. If you are a man, a stiff jacket and trousers that never quite seem to fit anyone particularly well, as though the entire union had agreed. Quite firmly that dignity and good tailoring were both optional expenses. There is something quietly unsettling about putting it on. Whoever you were an hour ago, a widow, a labourer, someone's mother, a person whose name used to be said with real warmth, none of that shows anymore. From the outside now you look exactly like everyone else in this room. That too was rather the point. From here you are sorted. Not by who you are, but by which category best fits you on a form the aged and infirm. The able-bodied and kept entirely separate the children. 4 groups, 4 different corridors, 4 different lives, all beginning at the exact same moment, in the exact same building without a single one of you having chosen a single part of it. By this point in the century, close to 600 of these unions stood scattered across England and Wales, each one running its own version of this same gate, this same bath, this same bell, this same quiet erasing of a name, which meant that wherever you happened to live, A fishing village on the coast, a smoke-choked mill town in the north, a narrow street in the shadow of London itself. A building exactly like this one was rarely more than a short, humiliating walk from your own front door. You are led down a corridor lined with identical iron beds. Somewhere close by you can hear the low murmur of other new arrivals, all of them living through the very same evening you just survived. Further off faintly, there is the sound of someone coughing in a slow practiced rhythm, and beyond that almost nothing at all. Just the particular quiet of a building that has learned to keep its grief indoors. Nobody speaks to you. Nobody really needs to. You already understand without a single word being said exactly what kind of night this has turned into. You lie down. The bell tolls once more, further away this time, marking some hour of the workhouse day you have not learned the meaning of yet, though you will soon enough whether you want to or not. And somewhere in that cold, quiet dormitory, one thought settles over you heavier than the thin blanket you've just been handed. This was never simply a shelter. This was a system. And somebody quite deliberately sat down and designed every single piece of it, right down to the shelf where your old clothes are waiting, right down to the exact number of minutes you're allowed to grieve the life you just walked away from. Which raises a rather uncomfortable question, does it not? Who exactly sits in a room and decides how much suffering counts as the correct amount to keep the poor in their place? Because that room existed. Those men existed with names and titles and reputations they were rather proud of, and the decisions made calmly inside it over tea on paper in the driest possible language somehow reached every gate, every cold bath, every locked door in the entire country, including the one you just walked through tonight. So who were they exactly, these men with their tea and their paperwork? Because that is the part nobody tells you when they hand you the postcard version of history. We love a villain with a face, a name, a portrait hanging crookedly in some forgotten hallway. But the truth is a little less cinematic and a little more uncomfortable. The system you just walked through tonight was not built by monsters twirling moustaches in the dark. It was built by reasonable men in good coats who believed with their whole chests that they were solving a problem. That, if you ask me, is the part worth sitting with. To understand them, though, we have to go back further than 1854, further than the gate, the bath, the shelf where your clothes are waiting. We have to go back roughly 230 years to a much older, much gentler idea about poverty. One that the men of 1834 would eventually decide had failed rather badly. Back in 1601, England passed what history now calls the Old Poor Law. It was almost embarrassingly simple by comparison. Each parish, meaning each small local church district, was responsible for its own poor. Overseers, ordinary men appointed from the community, collected a local tax called the poor rate, and used it to help neighbours who had fallen on hard times, widows, the sick, the old. People who through no particular fault of their own could no longer keep body and soul together. If your husband died at sea or your hands grew too stiff for the loom, the parish, at least in theory, was supposed to notice and do something about it. It was patchy. It was unevenly applied, depending on which parish you happened to be born in, some generous, some tight-fisted, but it was at its core built on a fairly small idea. Your community owes you something simply because you are part of it. For roughly 2 centuries that system limped along imperfect but functional. Then came a single winter in Berkshire that changed everything. In 1795, a group of magistrates met at a village called Speenhamland, trying to solve an urgent problem. Bread prices had shot up, wages had not kept pace, and half the working poor in the region could no longer afford to feed their own families despite having jobs. So the magistrates came up with what seemed at the time like a rather clever fix. They tied poor relief directly to the price of bread and the size of a worker's family. If your wages fell below a certain line, the parish would simply top you up. Feed your children, in other words, whether or not your employer paid you enough to do it yourself. It sounds almost decent, does it not? And for a while it probably felt that way too. But here is the uncomfortable twist the kind history seems to enjoy handing us. Once employers realised the parish would always cover the gap, some of them simply stopped bothering to pay a living wage at all. Why would they? The taxpayer was quietly picking up the difference. A farmer could pay a labourer next to nothing, and the parish, without quite meaning to, would fill in the rest. Within a generation, critics were arguing that Speenhamland had done the exact opposite of what it intended. Instead of protecting workers, it had in a strange roundabout way subsidised their exploitation, while poor rates across the country climbed to levels that made property owners furious. Some parishes watching their relief spending triple within a handful of years. It is a rather old lesson dressed up in old-fashioned clothing, honestly. Fix a symptom without touching the actual disease, and you often end up paying for both quietly for decades, until somebody with a grudge finally decides to tear the whole thing down and start over. Now into this argument walked a clergyman named Thomas Malthus, and I want you to remember his name because his fingerprints are all over what comes next. In 1798, Malthus published an essay that would haunt British social policy for the better part of a century. His argument, stripped down to its bones, went something like, "This population always grows faster than food supply can keep up with it, so any attempt to make life easier for the poor simply encourages them to have more children, which only deepens the very poverty you are trying to fix." Kindness in Malthus's cold arithmetic was not a cure, it was fuel. Have you ever met someone who seemed to believe quietly and completely that compassion itself was the actual problem? That is more or less what an entire generation of policymakers absorbed from Malthus's essay, whether he intended it that way or not. It gave anxious landowners something they badly wanted, a scientific-sounding excuse to feel less guilty about doing less. Now, to be fair to the man, and history rarely is fair to anyone, some historians will tell you Malthus himself might have flinched at how thoroughly his name got borrowed to justify what came later. He was a theorist, not a policy architect, and his later writing grew considerably more cautious about the very conclusions people kept drawing from his earlier work. But ideas, once they escape into the world, rarely stay loyal to the person who invented them. And by the 1820s, wealthy landowners and worried politicians had taken Malthus's population theory and welded it directly onto the growing panic over Speenhamland. The conclusion practically wrote itself. Stop being generous. Generosity is the problem. Which brings us finally to the room. In 1832, the government assembled a royal commission to investigate exactly how broken the old system had become. Two men in particular shaped what that commission would eventually conclude: Nassau Sr., an economist with rather firm opinions about self-reliance, and Edwin Chadwick, a young lawyer, and devoted follower of the philosopher Jeremy Bentham, the same Bentham who famously designed a prison called the Panopticon, built entirely around the idea that people behave better when they believe they are constantly being watched. Keep that detail in your pocket. It matters later once you start noticing how workhouses were actually built. Chadwick in particular is worth pausing on for a moment, because he is one of those strange historical figures who managed to be both a genuine reformer and a rather cold-blooded technocrat within the very same career. Years later, this same man would go on to champion Britain's first real public health reforms, arguing passionately that filthy, overcrowded slums were killing people through no fault of their own. It is an odd thing to sit with, is it not, that the man who helped design a system built to punish poverty would later spend decades trying to clean up the very conditions that poverty created? People, it turns out, are rarely simple enough to fit into one single box. The commissioners gathered testimony from across the country mountains, of it page after page of local officials complaining about rising costs, and in more than a few cases quietly implying that the poor themselves were simply lazy. Historians have pointed out since quite fairly that the evidence collected leaned rather conveniently toward the conclusion the commissioners had already reached before they started asking questions, which is, I think, a very human thing to do, and also a rather dangerous one when the people making the decision will never personally have to live with it. Their final report landed in 1834, and it introduced formally in writing the doctrine that would define poverty in England for the next 100 years. They called it less eligibility. Here is what that phrase actually meant, stripped of its bureaucratic dryness. Conditions inside the workhouse had to be worse, deliberately measurably worse than the living conditions of the poorest independent labourer surviving outside it. Not equal, not slightly less comfortable. Worse on purpose by design as official government policy. Sit with that for a second if you can. Think of the worst job you've ever worked, the coldest apartment you have ever lived in, the leanest month you have ever survived on the smallest budget imaginable. Now imagine a law written down and signed by Parliament stating explicitly that if you ever needed help, that help was legally required to feel worse than all of that. Not because anyone hated you personally, simply because making relief comfortable, the thinking went, would tempt too many people to stop working altogether. It is worth noticing too how tidy this logic sounds when it is written on paper in a well-lit committee room, and how differently it tends to sound once you're the one standing outside in the cold being measured against it. Paired with less eligibility came something called the workhouse test. If you were able-bodied and needed help, you no longer had a choice between accepting a bit of bread at home or moving into an institution. Outdoor relief, meaning any assistance given to you while you continued living in your own home, was essentially abolished for anyone capable of labour. The workhouse itself became the test. If you were desperate enough to walk through that gate and accept everything waiting on the other side of it, only then were you proven poor enough to deserve help. Desperation quite literally as an entrance exam. The bill passed through Parliament remarkably quickly with barely any real debate, and here is a detail I find almost darkly funny. Both major political parties of the day, the Whigs and the Tories groups that agreed on practically nothing else, found themselves in near total harmony on this one. It is a strange thing to notice watching history from this distance, how quickly opposing sides can find common ground the moment the people affected have no seat at the table to argue back. The new law reorganised the entire country. Local parishes were grouped together into larger administrative units called unions, each one required to build or maintain its own workhouse, run by a locally elected board of guardians. Standing above all of them sat a new body in London, the Poor Law Commission, just 3 men holding an almost unbelievable amount of power over how millions of poor citizens across the country would be treated with surprisingly little direct oversight from Parliament itself. It was in its own quiet way one of the very first modern bureaucracies Britain had ever built, efficient, centralised, and almost entirely unaccountable to the people living under it. Naturally, people noticed, and people were furious. A reformer named Richard Ostler became one of the loudest voices against the new system, publicly branding workhouses prisons for the poor, a phrase that spread through pamphlets and newspapers with the kind of speed we would probably call viral today if the word had existed yet. Working communities across the north gave these buildings their own bitter nickname too, calling them Bastille after the infamous Paris prison that had been stormed by an angry crowd decades earlier. The comparison was not exactly subtle. People were telling their own government in fairly plain language that these new buildings looked a great deal like prisons for a crime nobody had actually committed. What grew out of that anger became known as the anti-poor law movement, and for a while it was one of the largest grassroots protest movements Britain had seen in a generation. Mass meetings drew thousands of people into market squares across the industrial north, Ordinary labourers standing shoulder to shoulder with small shopkeepers, all of them united by one fairly simple fear that a single stretch of bad luck could now cost them their family, their freedom, and their name all at once. Some historians even trace a direct line between this outrage and the birth of Chartism, a few years later, that broader working-class push for the right to vote on the fairly reasonable logic that if ordinary people had actually been sitting in that room in 1834, this particular law might never have made it past the first reading. That anger did not stay confined to pamphlets and petitions for long. In 1842, during a fresh wave of Chartist unrest, a crowd in the town of Stockport marched on the local workhouse and attacked it directly, one small, furious symbol of just how deeply this new system had frightened ordinary people who feared correctly that they themselves might end up on the wrong side of that gate one day. And here is where the story gets, in my opinion, quietly fascinating, in the way only bureaucratic failure really can be. The whole beautifully rigid theory of a less eligibility worked out on paper by careful men in careful rooms ran directly into the messy reality of an industrializing country. In the manufacturing towns of the north, entire local economies would occasionally collapse overnight, throwing thousands of able-bodied workers out of a job all at once through absolutely no fault of their own. You cannot force 10,000 newly unemployed factory workers into a workhouse built for a few hundred people. There simply was not room, and even the commissioners eventually had to admit it. In 1837, barely 3 years after the ink had dried, officials were quietly forced to allow outdoor relief again in Nottingham, because the alternative was not thrift or discipline. It was outright chaos, which tells you something rather important about ideology in general, I think, whether we are talking about the 1830s or right now tonight, wherever you happen to be listening from. A theory can sound flawless in a committee room. Balanced budgets, careful incentives, tidy moral logic on a printed page, and then it meets an actual human being, cold, hungry, and standing outside a locked gate in the rain, and suddenly all that tidy logic starts to look a great deal less impressive. Paper never has to shiver, people do. So that is who they were. Not villains in the theatrical sense, not men twirling a cane in some smoke-filled back room. Economists, lawyers, reverends, men who in their own carefully reasoned minds believed wholeheartedly that suffering could be engineered into something useful, something almost noble if you designed it precisely enough on paper. That, honestly, might be the most unsettling part of the entire story. Cruelty is easy to spot when it wears a scowl. It is far harder to notice when it arrives wearing a waistcoat holding a ledger and sincerely convinced it is doing you a favour. But theory is one thing, and theory, once it leaves the committee room and gets bricked, mortared and locked into an actual building, becomes something else entirely. It stops being an argument in a report and starts being a bell that tells you exactly when to wake. A rulebook thick enough to govern your every breath, your every meal, your every quiet moment of rest. A single, rigid, unforgiving rhythm that would decide precisely how every single hour of your day unfolded from the moment that bell rang until the moment it rang again, whether you happen to agree with the men who designed it or not. And that rhythm, that quiet, exhausting, deliberately engineered rhythm, is exactly where we need to go next. There is a particular sound that ruled every single hour inside that building, and it was not a voice, not a master's shout, not a guardian's footstep. It was a bell plain and iron, and utterly indifferent to how you felt about hearing it. That bell did not care whether you had slept. It did not care if you were grieving or aching or simply wanted 5 more minutes under a thin blanket before facing another day exactly like the one before it. It rang, and your body was expected to obey because inside these walls time itself had stopped belonging to you. Somewhere in London a clockmaker had built that bell to keep perfect honest time. Nobody involved in that transaction seemed particularly concerned with what perfect honest time actually cost the people forced to live inside its rhythm. Let me walk you through what that actually looked like hour by hour, because the schedule was not loosely suggested. It was law written down by the very commissioners we just spent the last stretch getting to know. The rising bell sounded at 6 o'clock in the morning during the warmer months, pushed back to 7. Once winter made the mornings too dark to bother waking anyone earlier. You washed, you dressed, and you stood for roll call because the workhouse needed to know with absolute certainty exactly how many bodies it currently owned. Breakfast followed at 6:30, then work straight through until noon, an hour for dinner, back to work until 6 in the evening, supper until 7, and by 8 o'clock, whether or not you felt remotely tired, you were expected to be lying in that iron bed in the dark, waiting for the whole rhythm to repeat itself tomorrow, and the day after that, and the day after that for as long as you remained inside. I want you to notice something about that timetable because it is easy to skim past. There is no room in it, no unclaimed hour, no quiet gap where a person could simply exist without being accounted for. Every single minute of your day had already been decided by men you would never meet sitting in an office you would never see, and the bell was simply how their decision reached you. Somebody, of course, had to enforce all of it, and the workhouse ran on its own small hierarchy of authority, almost like a village nobody had chosen to live in. At the top sat the master and his wife, who usually served as matron together, responsible for the entire daily operation. Beneath them stood a chaplain, whose job extended well past Sunday sermons into general moral supervision, a schoolmaster and schoolmistress assigned to the children's wing, a medical officer who was in many unions, dramatically overworked and underpaid for the number of patients expected of him, and a porter who controlled the one thing that mattered more than almost anything else inside those walls, the gate itself, and who was permitted to pass through it. Every one of these figures answered on paper, at least to a locally elected board of guardians, the very same body we met, while talking about how this system first came into being. In practice, though, the guardians visited only occasionally, which meant that day to day your entire experience of the institution came down to a small handful of people you had never chosen and could not vote out. Now here is where the earlier detail I asked you to remember finally earns its keep. Do you recall Edwin Chadwick and his devotion to a philosopher named Jeremy Bentham, if you remember, designed a prison called the Panopticon, built around one central, rather unsettling idea. If people believe they might be watched at any given moment, they behave as though they are being watched at every moment, whether an actual eye is on them or not. It turns out this exact principle did not stay confined to prisons. It became almost brick for brick the blueprint for the workhouse itself. A young architect named Sampson Kempthorne, barely into his 20s, happened to have a father who was friendly with one of the poor law commissioners, which is, I suppose, one way careers have always worked. In 1835, Kempthorne produced the model plans that most of the country's new workhouses would be built from, and he described his own guiding principle rather plainly. Everything radiated outward from a single central octagonal hub where the master's quarters sat with wings for each class of pauper, branching off it like spokes on a wheel, able-bodied men, able-bodied women, the elderly and infirm boys, girls, each group physically separated, each one visible, at least in theory, from that one central point. The very first workhouse built under the new law went up in the market town of Abingdon, following Kempthorne's six-sided version of the design, and once local officials elsewhere saw how neatly it solved the problem of watching hundreds of people with only a handful of staff, the shape spread quickly. Between 1834 and 1841, something like 320 of these buildings went up across the country, most of them following this same cruciform shape, or that six-sided variation nicknamed the Y plan. Picture it for a moment if you can. A single master standing at the centre of a building shaped almost like a wheel, able to glance down any wing, and at least in principle see everyone inside it. You were never told exactly when you were being watched, which meant, of course, that the only sensible choice was to behave as though you always were. And behaviour inside these walls was regulated down to a level that honestly borders on the absurd. There were rules against talking during meals, rules restricting conversation in the dormitories after a certain hour, rules requiring permission simply to step outside your designated wing, even to visit a spouse or a parent housed in the very same building. Personal possessions beyond whatever small items the master allowed you to keep were generally forbidden, which meant that even a favourite ribbon or a child's carved toy could be confiscated on sight, if a member of staff decided it counted as clutter rather than comfort. Religion too was folded directly into the daily rule book, not as a comfort you were free to accept or decline, but as another item on the schedule. Prayers were read aloud before breakfast and again after supper. Attendance was recorded, rather like a roll call of the soul, and missing a Sunday service without a doctor's note could earn you the same disorderly mark as swearing at a supervisor. The chaplain's role in practice sat somewhere between spiritual guidance and quiet crowd control, and it is hard not to notice looking back how conveniently a weekly sermon on patience and humility served the exact same purpose as the bell and the octagonal hub. Obedience dressed up in 3 different disguises still adds up to the same thing. I sometimes think the Victorians could have organised an invasion of a small country with the same thoroughness they applied to deciding exactly how loudly a person was permitted to speak at supper. Every offence, and I do mean nearly every offence you could imagine, was neatly sorted into one of 2 official categories: disorderly or refractory. Disorderly covered the smaller stuff: swearing, feigning illness to avoid work, playing cards if you happened to have a deck. Refractory was reserved for repeat offenders or anyone who directly defied an order from a master or matron. Historians who have gone through surviving punishment books from that period found that roughly 62 out of every 100 recorded offences were disorderly, while about 22 out of every 100 crossed into refractory territory. The punishments themselves were almost always the same handful of options: a reduced diet, since food was already scarce enough to make that sting; extra unpaid labour; or for anything more serious, several hours, sometimes days, locked alone in a bare cell. What strikes me reading through these records now is how thin the line often was between actual defiance and simple human limitation. In one surviving letter, a pauper named Thomas Swingler complained formally in writing that he had been punished for failing to complete a labour task that was quite plainly beyond what his body could physically manage. The rulebook made no meaningful distinction between a man who refused to work and a man who truly could not. Both on paper looked exactly the same: refractory insubordinate punished accordingly. Let me give you a name, because statistics have a way of floating past us until a real person is attached to them. In the records of the Bethnal Green Workhouse, there is a documented case of a pauper named James Bates, who was struck in the eye by a superintendent, and then, rather than receiving any care for the injury, was placed into a punishment cell with almost nothing but a little water. Nobody involved seems to have questioned, at least not on paper, why the person who caused the injury was also the one deciding the punishment for it. Up in Norwich, the punishment book records 3 women, Hannah Harvey, Martha Chatton and Esther Betts, written up together for, in the master's own words, persisting in being disorderly and annoying the other inmates, along with what he primly called the use of very foul language. I rather like that particular entry, honestly. Even stripped of freedom, stripped of comfort, stripped of nearly everything else, these three women apparently still had enough spirit left to make an entire workhouse master reach for his pen in irritation. There is something almost stubbornly human about that. Do you not think being told in every possible way that you no longer matter, and responding with exactly the kind of noise that proves you still do? But here is where I want to offer you something the system itself never accounted for, and it is one of my favourite quiet discoveries in all of this research. Not every master ran his workhouse the same way, no matter how detailed the rulebook tried to be. A man named Benjamin Woodcock kept a diary during his years as master of the Barnet Union Workhouse, and reading it now feels almost like eavesdropping on a version of this story the official records rarely bother to tell. When a group of boys destroyed part of the workhouse garden hedge, Woodcock simply talked to them, rather than reaching immediately for punishment. When a man named Thomas Bourne returned from church one evening, clearly the worse for drink, Woodcock noted that it was his first offence that the man seemed honestly sorry went quietly to bed without argument, and so in Woodcock's own words he chose not to punish him at all. It is worth sitting with that for a second. The exact same law, the exact same rulebook, the exact same architecture of surveillance could produce two entirely different daily experiences depending almost entirely on the personal character of one single man standing at the centre of that octagonal hub. Some masters ran their wing like a small grim prison, quick with the punishment book, generous with the solitary cell. Others, like Woodcock, appear to have understood that most of the people in front of them were simply exhausted, not dangerous, and chose whenever the rules technically allowed it to be a little more human than the paperwork strictly required. The system on paper promised total uniformity, the exact same treatment from Cornwall to Yorkshire. The reality, once you actually go looking for it in the archives, turns out to be far messier and honestly far more interesting. Have you ever noticed how much of a person's daily experience under any strict system depends less on the rules themselves and more on who happens to be standing there enforcing them? That is not a uniquely Victorian problem. It might be one of the more uncomfortable truths about institutions in general then and now, and it is worth remembering the next time somebody tells you a rule is a rule is a rule, as though the person holding the key never mattered at all. The rigidity did soften a little eventually, though slowly and only in places. By the 1860s, some workhouses had begun accepting donated books and old magazines for inmates to read, and a single hour between 7 and 8 in the evening was set aside officially for something almost startling to see written down in a poor law document: recreation. Occasionally there might even be a talk or a small performance, something to break the monotony of a day otherwise measured entirely in bells. It was not generosity exactly. It was closer to a grudging admission, decades late, that human beings, even poor ones, apparently could not be run indefinitely on discipline alone, and that a person denied every scrap of pleasure for years on end tends eventually to stop being useful to anyone, including the institution holding them. Still, none of that changes what the core of the place remained for most of its history. A system built to control not just where you slept or what you wore, which we have already walked through together, but how you spoke when you moved, who you were allowed to see, and how every single hour of your day would unfold whether you agreed with any of it or not. Your name still existed somewhere on that admission ledger, but your time, every quiet minute of it, now belonged to the institution. Even your grief, it seems, had a scheduled slot wedged somewhere between supper and the 8 o'clock bell, and no minute later. There was in a strange way an almost mathematical precision to how thoroughly a person's inner life could be organised right out of existence, one printed rule at a time. And once your time belongs to somebody else, the next question becomes rather unavoidable, does it not? What exactly did they intend to do with all of it? Because 7 hours of that timetable every single day, 6 days out of 7 were labelled simply as work, and nobody handed you a choice in the matter. Idle hours were considered almost as dangerous as idle hands in the minds of the men who built this system, and they had very particular, very deliberate ideas about what your body owed them in exchange for a roof and a bowl of something warm. Ideas that, once you actually see what the work involved, tell you a great deal more about this institution and about the century that built it than any rule book ever could. Here is a question worth asking before we go any further. If you wanted to build a job specifically designed to feel like punishment, while still technically calling it employment, where would you even start? Because that is more or less the exact puzzle the architects of this system sat down and solved, and the answer they landed on tells you almost everything you need to know about how they viewed the people forced to do it. It is in its own quiet way one of the more revealing pieces of this entire story, because it is not really about labour at all. It is about what a government decides a person's suffering is allowed to look like once that suffering has to fit tidily inside an annual budget. The rules, when you actually read them, are oddly precise about this. Whatever task you were assigned inside the workhouse had to satisfy 2 conditions at once, and on the surface they almost sound reasonable. First, the work could not compete with ordinary paid employment outside the walls. No undercutting local tradesmen, no flooding the market with free labour. A struggling shopkeeper down the road could never match. Second, the task was not supposed to be what the commissioners rather delicately called essentially penal meaning. It could not be pure, pointless punishment with no product at the end of it. The way a prison treadmill offered nothing but exhaustion for exhaustion's sake. It had to look productive. It had to look almost respectable on paper, which meant somebody had to go looking for jobs that were miserable enough to discourage anyone from staying longer than absolutely necessary, harmless enough not to threaten local trade, and just useful enough to keep the books looking tidy. It is a strange kind of design problem when you think about it. Engineering suffering with a straight face and calling it economic policy. And to their credit, or perhaps their discredit, the men responsible for this particular puzzle did not settle for just one solution. They found several, each suited to a slightly different part of the body and a slightly different kind of person. Let's start with a task almost everyone eventually met men and women both because it required no particular skill and, frankly, no particular mercy. Oakum picking. Picture a coil of old tarred rope, the kind pulled from a ship long past its working life, stiff, blackened, smelling faintly of salt and pitch, even years after leaving the sea. Your job, hour after hour, was to unravel it, strand by strand, teasing the tightly twisted fibres apart with nothing but your fingers, until what had once been thick rope became something closer to loose, fluffy fibre. That fibre, once collected, was sold back to the shipbuilding trade mixed with tar and packed into the seams between a ship's timbers to keep seawater out. In other words, the very ropes that once held sailing vessels together were quite literally taken apart by the poorest hands in England and turned back into the material that kept other ships afloat. It sounds almost meditative described like that, does it not? It was not. The old tar hardened the rope until it cut like thin wire against fingertips already cracked from cold water and rough soap. Fingernails split, skin split, and there was no quota you could simply decide not to meet because your food quite directly depended on finishing it. I've read more than one account describing the particular ache oakum picking left behind a kind of raw, stinging soreness that lingered well past the moment the work itself ended for the day, which is a rather brutal thing to carry into whatever passed for rest that night. There is a phrase still floating around the English language today, money for old rope, meaning something easy, barely worth the effort. I find it almost bitterly funny that the phrase likely traces back to exactly this task because whoever coined it clearly never spent an entire winter afternoon with bleeding fingertips unravelling someone else's discarded ship's rigging one stubborn fibre at a time. Oakum picking was so thoroughly associated with unpleasant low-status labour that prisons adopted the exact same task for convicted criminals, which tells you something rather pointed about where paupers technically sat in the eyes of the law, compared to people who had actually broken it. Then there was stone breaking, mostly assigned to the men, though by no means only to them. Large stones quarried and delivered by the cartload had to be broken down into pieces small enough to pass through an iron grate of a specific size material destined for the roads being built and repaired across a country truly obsessed with better transportation. A hammer, a stone, hour after hour in all weather until your pile finally matched the size the overseer demanded. There was no partial credit for effort. The stone either fit through that grate or it did not, and if it did not, you simply kept swinging until it did. Here is a small detail I find quietly telling. The very roads that grew smoother, faster and more reliable across Victorian Britain roads, that carried merchants' mail coaches and eventually the beginnings of modern commerce, were built in no small part from stone broken by the hands of people the country had officially declared too poor to matter. Progress, it turns out, rarely announces exactly whose labour it was standing on, and the size of the pile expected of you was not left to anyone's imagination or mercy either. Guardians in different unions set their own daily quotas, and the difference between one workhouse and its neighbour could be considerable, sometimes little more than a single hundredweight, expected in a day, sometimes well over 10 times that amount, depending entirely on how strict the local board happened to feel that particular year. Now, bone crushing. I want to tread carefully here because this particular task is going to matter a great deal more later in our story in ways that shook the entire system to its foundations, and I would rather not spend all of that impact early. For now, let me simply describe what the job actually involved, because even stripped of everything else, it is not a pleasant picture. Old animal bones gathered from slaughterhouses and kitchens arrived at the workhouse yard in heaps, often still carrying scraps of flesh cartilage and marrow that had not quite finished rotting away. Workers were given a heavy iron rammer, sometimes weighing close to 30 pounds, and set to pounding those bones down into a coarse dust, which was then sold on as fertilizer for local farms. The stench alone was reportedly enough to turn the stomach of anyone unaccustomed to it, thick, sweetish, and clinging, the kind of smell that apparently followed a person home in their clothes and hair long after the shift ended. The physical strain of repeatedly lifting and driving that weight downward hour after hour left men with torn hands and, in more than a few recorded cases, faces scarred by flying shards of splintered bone. And yet on the union's ledger this counted as one of the more profitable tasks available. Old bones bought cheaply, ground bone dust sold for considerably more. A tidy little business built entirely on unpaid punishing labour. Hold on to that particular detail, the heap of bones, the smell, the hunger of the people forced to stand over it hour after hour. We are coming back to this exact yard before our night together is through. And what happened there in one specific workhouse, on one specific set of records, ended up shaking the entire system to its foundations, forcing men in Parliament to finally ask a question they had spent years quietly avoiding. For now, I will simply say this. Of every single task inside that building, this was the one where hunger and labour sat closest together, close enough that the distance between them eventually collapsed entirely, with consequences nobody in that yard could have predicted. There were quieter tasks too, less brutal on paper, though rarely gentle in practice. Some unions kept a handmill on site, and able-bodied inmates took turns grinding corn for the workhouse's own bread, walking in slow, endless circles around a wooden shaft for hours at a stretch, a job that asked less of your hands than oakum and less of your back than stone, but wore down something quieter, instead a kind of patience that simply runs out after the 1000th turn of the same wheel. Older men past the age where the guardians expected much heavy labour from them were often sent to the kitchen garden instead, tending vegetable beds that fed the very institution holding them. Several workhouses even kept a few pigs or a small flock of chickens on the grounds, less out of any fondness for farming, and more because a union that grew its own cabbages and raised its own bacon spent noticeably less feeding the people it was legally obligated to feed. Even the animals, in their own small way, were part of the arithmetic. Now let's step away from the men's yard for a moment, because I think the labour performed by women inside these buildings tends to get mentioned far too briefly in most retellings of this history, almost as an afterthought, when in reality it was the labour actually keeping the entire institution alive. Cooking, cleaning, laundry on an industrial scale, which meant hauling, scrubbing, wringing and hanging the bedding and clothing for sometimes several hundred people, using nothing more advanced than a mangler washboard and raw physical effort in a room thick with steam and the particular ache of standing over hot water for 10 hours straight. Needlework, mending and making the very uniforms every new arrival was handed at that gate we walked through earlier. Nursing duties in the infirmary often performed rather alarmingly by inmates with no medical training whatsoever, simply because qualified staff were expensive and unpaid. Pauper labour was not. One surviving report from a workhouse in Macclesfield dated 1888 actually breaks the numbers down in a way I find oddly moving. Among the able-bodied women recorded that year, 21 working as washers, 22 as sewers and knitters, 12 scrubbing floors, 12 more assisting elsewhere, 4 in the kitchen, 4 minding the nursery, 4 darning stockings. On the men's side, a rather different list: 2 joiners, 1 slater, 1 upholsterer, 1 blacksmith, several minding the boilers, 18 simply peeling potatoes. It reads almost like a census of quiet exhaustion, does it not? One entire small town's worth of labour, unpaid, uncredited, keeping hundreds of strangers, fed, clothed and washed every single day without a single name attached to most of it, in any record anyone bothered to keep. Reduce an entire community down to job titles on a ledger, and it starts to look almost administrative, almost dull. Remember that every single one of those numbers was a person standing at a washboard until her hands went numb, and it stops looking dull rather quickly. Can I ask you something, actually, while we sit with that list for a moment? How many people in your own life right now are doing exactly that kind of invisible, unglamorous work that keeps everything around them running work? Nobody writes songs about work that only gets noticed the moment it stops. I think about that a little differently after spending time with records like this one. As the century wore on, a few unions, to their credit, started drifting away from purely punitive labour towards something with slightly more dignity attached to it. Places like Holborn began teaching actual trades inside their walls: shoemaking, tailoring, bricklaying, even basic plumbing skills a person might honestly carry with them once they eventually walked back out that gate. It was not universal, and it was not fast, but it does suggest something worth noticing. Even a system built almost entirely around deterrence eventually discovers that pure punishment stretched out over decades produces very little, except more people who need help again next winter. Teaching someone an actual trade, however grudgingly, at least gave a portion of that labour somewhere to go, besides straight back into the same hopeless cycle. I find that shift almost more interesting than the cruelty itself, honestly, because it suggests the system was never quite as ideologically pure as the men who designed it in 1834 might have liked. Ideas about deterrence and less eligibility looked immaculate on paper back in that committee room we spent an earlier stretch of tonight sitting in together. But run any institution long enough and reality has an odd habit of sanding down even the sharpest theory. Somebody somewhere in Holborn eventually looked at a man who'd spent 3 years breaking stone into identical useless little piles and asked a rather practical question. What exactly are we accomplishing here besides making sure he never wants to come back? Teaching him to lay bricks at least gave both the man and the parish something to actually show for all those wasted hours, because that underneath all of it is really what this entire yard of tasks was quietly built to do. Not simply to occupy your hands, though it certainly did that. It was designed to make the workhouse pay for itself, or at least come close. Broken stone sold to road builders, bone dust sold to farmers, vegetables grown in its own garden, laundry and mending, absorbed straight back into daily operating costs. The union would otherwise have had to fund some other way. Your labour, in other words, was not incidental to your stay. It was in a very real sense part of how the whole institution justified its own existence to the ratepayers, footing the bill a self-sustaining little economy, built entirely on the backs of people who had nowhere else left to stand. And there is something almost darkly poetic about that arrangement if you sit with it long enough. The very same men who insisted the poor were a drain on the public purse built an entire system that quietly depended on extracting as much unpaid value from those exact same poor as physically possible. Deterrence and profit, it turns out, made surprisingly comfortable bedfellows, and after 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours of that whatever task happened to be yours that particular day, there was really only one question left standing between you and whatever passed for rest that night. What exactly would they actually give you to eat in exchange for all of it? Because the answer to that question, when you look at what was actually written down on the union's own dietary tables, tells you almost as much about this system as the labour itself ever could. The answer, as it turns out, was not left to chance or to whichever cook happened to be on duty that week, or to the master's mood on a particular Tuesday. It was written down in advance on an official document called a dietary, and if you've never heard that word used quite this way before, welcome to one of the strangest little corners of this entire system. Food inside these walls was not a kindness extended day by day. It was policy, fixed, printed and enforced with the same bureaucratic precision we have already seen applied to Bell's timetables and punishment books. Somewhere in an office far from any kitchen, a committee had already decided in advance exactly how hungry you were allowed to feel on any given evening, and had put that decision into writing long before you ever walked through the gate. The Central Poor Law Commission issued 6 official example charts back in 1836, and every board of guardians across the country was expected to select one or adapt it slightly and stick to it. Nothing improvised, nothing generous on a whim. One surviving record from the West London Union in 1838 lays it out with almost comic precision: 12 ounces of bread per day for every adult inmate, no more, no less. Women over 60 were permitted a small weekly allowance of tea and sugar at the guardian's discretion, mind you, not as a right. Children under 9 were, in the Commission's own rather chilling phrase, to be dieted at discretion, while those over 9 simply received whatever the adult women received. Read that again for a moment. An entire government body sat down and decided formally exactly how many ounces of bread a hungry 9-year-old deserved, and wrote it into law as though they were setting a tax rate. I want you to notice the word discretion showing up twice in that same short passage, because it is doing a great deal of quiet work. Discretion sounds generous, almost kind as though someone in charge might simply use good judgment and offer a little extra to a shivering child or a frail widow. In practice, discretion meant the opposite. It meant nothing was actually guaranteed. A hungry 9-year-old's dinner depended entirely on whichever guardian happened to be paying attention that particular week, and guardians, as we already know from the men who designed this whole system, were rarely in the business of erring toward generosity. Let me give you a real example, because abstract ounces on a page rarely land the way an actual daily menu does. At Axbridge Union in Somerset, surviving records describe breakfast as 8 ounces of bread and a pint and a half of gruel. Dinner brought soup or occasionally meat and vegetables depending on the day of the week. Supper circled back to bread and cheese. And according to the very same records, the food itself was frequently, in the historian's own words, of poor quality, and often tainted as well. So it was not simply thin, it was not simply repetitive. On a fairly regular basis, it was food that had already started going bad before it ever reached your bowl. Imagine that particular indignity for a moment, working a full 10-hour day at stone breaking or laundry arriving at supper, truly famished and being handed bread with the faint unmistakable smell of mould already creeping into its crust, with absolutely no alternative sitting anywhere on that table. Now, gruel deserves a moment of its own because it sat at the absolute centre of workhouse life morning and night for decades. At its most basic, gruel is oatmeal boiled in water until it thins into something you could, if you were being generous, call porridge, though most surviving accounts describe it as thin enough to drink straight from the bowl rather than eat with a spoon. Cheap to make, filling enough to quiet a stomach for an hour or two. Nutritionally, it offered barely more than warmth and the illusion of a meal. Other unions tried to add a little more structure to the misery at least. Records from Ripon Workhouse in Yorkshire show a dietary approved in 1853 offering 7 ounces of bread, alongside either a pint and a half of porridge or 2 ounces of cheese for breakfast and supper, with dinner rotating between cooked meat and potatoes, bread and soup, or a meat and potato pie on certain days. Women and children, the records note plainly, were served slightly less than the men, as though hunger itself came with a built-in hierarchy of who deserved to feel it least. It was by the standards of the system a relatively considered attempt at balance. And even then, historians looking back at that same Ripon dietary point out it still lacked meaningful fruit, or vegetables still fell short on basic vitamins, still left grown adults doing 10 hours of physical labour on something closer to survival rations than an actual meal. Here is where I want to tell you something that still honestly catches in my throat a little even now. In 1909, decades after the system had supposedly grown gentler, a guardian at the Rochford Union Workhouse named James Norden stood up at a board meeting and reported something he had personally witnessed while walking through the dining hall. Out of 80 pots of gruel served that day, 47 had gone completely untouched. Not because the inmates were not hungry, because the gruel was, in his own words, simply unfit to eat. He went further, telling the board that elderly inmates in his care that day had nothing to eat or drink but dry bread and water. This was not 1834 anymore. Remember, not the early chaotic first years of a brand new law still finding its feet. This was 1909, 3/4 of a century into the system's life, with a nationally approved cookbook and roughly 50 sanctioned dishes theoretically available to draw from, and somewhere in Essex, elderly paupers were still being handed nothing but dry bread and water for their evening meal. Do you know what happened to that untouched gruel, the 47 full pots of it? It went to the workhouse pigs. Let that sit with you for a second. In a building funded specifically to keep human beings from starving, the pigs on site were quite literally eating better than some of the elderly people the institution was legally responsible for feeding. Have you ever sat across from someone who was clearly still hungry after a meal and quietly wondered whether the problem was really the food itself or something further up the chain that nobody wanted to look at too closely? Because that is precisely the question. A room full of Victorian guardians were finally forced to confront a full 75 years after the system began, and it apparently took a man standing up and simply saying the food was going to the pigs before anyone bothered writing it down. I also want to mention, because it feels important, that none of this was uniform across the country, which is precisely what made it so difficult for anyone outside a particular union to actually track or challenge. A dietary approved in a wealthy southern parish with its own kitchen garden, and a guardian or two who honestly cared might look almost reasonable on paper. The exact same official framework applied by a stingier board 2 counties over, or during a harsher winter when local rates ran thin, could produce something considerably closer to what you just heard from Rochford. Hunger, in other words, was never evenly distributed. It depended once again on geography on the season, and on the particular character of whoever happened to be holding the purse strings that year. The same uncomfortable pattern we noticed earlier when we talked about how differently individual masters chose to enforce the rulebook. Put those two things side by side for a moment, because I think it matters more than either fact does on its own. 7, 8, sometimes 10 hours of physical labour, stone-breaking laundry, that iron rammer we spoke about earlier, and a diet built almost entirely from bread-thin gruel, and the occasional scrap of meat 2 or 3 days a week. Any modern nutritionist looking at those two numbers together would tell you plainly that the arithmetic simply does not balance. The body was being asked to output considerably more energy than it was ever given to work with week after week, year after year, for as long as a person remained inside. Fatigue, dizziness, slow-healing wounds, a general fragility that made every minor illness considerably more dangerous than it should have been. All of it traces back, at least in part, to a dietary chart drawn up by men who never once had to swing a hammer on the calories they had rationed for somebody else. This wasn't accidental stinginess either, not entirely. Remember the principle we spent time with earlier, less eligibility, the deliberate insistence that conditions inside the workhouse had to sit below whatever the poorest independent labourer could scrape together outside it. Food was where that principle became almost mathematically literal. Guardians were not simply permitted to underfeed inmates. In a strange backward sort of way, doing so aligned rather neatly with the entire founding logic of the institution. A workhouse that fed its inmates comfortably risked accusations of being too attractive, too soft a place the merely lazy might choose over honest labour. Hunger, uncomfortable as it is to say, plainly was functioning exactly as intended most of the time in most unions for most of the century. Think about what that actually requires logistically for a moment. Somewhere a clerk had to sit down and estimate what the poorest working family in the parish could typically afford to eat that season, then design a workhouse diet that fell just slightly below it. Wages rose or fell, harvest failed or flourished, bread prices swung wildly from one winter to the next, and the official dietary was meant to track all of it downward, a kind of grim moving target always aimed at staying one careful notch beneath whatever misery already existed outside the gate. It is one thing to accept that a system is cruel by accident through neglect or incompetence. It is another thing entirely to realize the cruelty required this much careful ongoing calculation to maintain. Public opinion, to its credit, did not simply accept all of this quietly. In 1843, a satirical song made the rounds titled, quite bluntly, "Just Starve Us," mocking the entire system through the voice of an imaginary well-fed workhouse overseer, cheerfully explaining his budget to a room of skeletal inmates. The surviving illustration that accompanied it shows exactly the contrast you would expect. A plump, comfortable official standing over ragged, hollow-cheeked paupers, drawn with just enough exaggeration to sting. It is dark humour, the kind that only really works when everybody listening already understands exactly how true the joke is. I rather admire that particular strain of Victorian protest honestly using a music hall tune to smuggle a serious accusation directly into a room full of people who might otherwise have looked away from a pamphlet or a parliamentary report. Comedy, it turns out, has always been rather good at sneaking uncomfortable truths past an audience's guard. Slowly, though, something did begin shifting, and the credit largely belongs to a physician named Dr. Edward Smith, a nutrition pioneer history has treated with far less attention than he probably deserves. In the 1860s, Smith actually studied workhouse diets, scientifically measuring what these meals were providing against what a working human body actually required to function, rather than simply asking what the smallest possible sum could technically keep someone alive. His findings quietly nudged several unions towards slightly more generous, more balanced rations treating nutrition, for perhaps the first time in this entire story, as a matter of biology rather than morality. It took nearly 40 more years for that nudge to become official policy nationwide, but in 1900 a genuine overhaul finally arrived. Each workhouse could now build its own weekly menu from a list of roughly 50 approved dishes, with an accompanying cookbook distributed to help standardize the results: Irish stew, shepherd's pie, pasties, cake, roly-poly pudding of all things appearing on a poor law menu after nearly 7 decades of bread and gruel. It is worth pausing on how strange and how quietly hopeful that particular shift actually is. An institution built almost entirely around deprivation, eventually admitted on paper in an official cookbook no less that pudding was allowed. 66 years is a long time to wait for pudding, but I suppose it beats never getting there at all. And yet for the vast majority of people who ever walk through that gate, we spent our first stretch together describing none of that later. Softening arrived in time. Diet Remember was also one of the standard levers of punishment we discussed earlier. An already thin ration made thinner still whenever a master decided a disorderly mark was in order, which meant hunger inside these walls was never simply about poverty in general. It could be switched on deliberately as discipline applied to a body that had already been surviving on barely enough to function in the first place. A person could arrive already thin from months of hardship outside the gate, and leave the workhouse thinner still, having somehow managed to be punished twice over for the exact same original crime of being poor. So that is what filled your stomach, or rather what mostly failed to: thin gruel. Rationed bread measured out in exact ounces by men who never once had to eat it themselves. Meat on 2 or 3 days a week if you were fortunate enough to land in a union that bothered. And a system perfectly willing to let a bowl go to the pigs before admitting the recipe itself was the problem. But hunger, as brutal as it is, was never the only kind of emptiness this institution specialized in creating. There was another hollowing out happening at the exact same time in the exact same building, one that had nothing to do with your stomach at all, and possibly cut even deeper than an empty bowl ever could. Because a person can somehow learn to survive on thin gruel and stale bread. Learning to survive without the people you love sitting anywhere nearby is an entirely different kind of hunger altogether. Here is something worth sitting with for a moment before we go any further into this particular ache. Separating families inside these buildings was never a scheduling accident, some unfortunate byproduct of overcrowding or limited space. It was written into the founding blueprint of the entire system, as deliberately as the bell, as deliberately as the dietary chart we just finished walking through together. Somewhere in that same committee room, we have already spent time in a specific decision, was made in plain language that husbands and wives entering the workhouse would not be permitted to live together, regardless of how long they had been married, regardless of their age, regardless of anything at all. And the reasoning behind it, once you actually read it in the Commissioner's own words, is almost breathtaking in its coldness. Not careless, not thoughtless, deliberate, in the way only a policy written by people who will never personally feel its consequences can afford to be. They were worried about breeding. That is not my paraphrase for dramatic effect. That is essentially the term used again and again in the correspondence and reports surrounding this particular rule. Middle-class reformers had convinced themselves that poor families were in some sense manufacturing more poverty on purpose, producing children specifically to claim a larger share of parish relief. Keep a married couple apart, the logic went, and you remove the opportunity entirely. It is worth pausing on how strange that sentence actually is. An entire government policy built around the assumption that the people it was meant to help could not be trusted with something as basic as sharing a bedroom with their own spouse. You may recognize the fingerprints here, and I would be surprised if you did not, since we spent a considerable stretch of this evening already sitting with the man responsible for them. Thomas Malthus never wrote a single word instructing anyone to physically separate husbands from wives. But his population theory, the one insisting that any comfort extended to the poor only encouraged more children they could not afford, gave the architects of this system exactly the intellectual permission they needed to treat marriage itself as a kind of public liability. It is one thing to discourage a birth rate through economic pressure. It is quite another to accomplish it through padlocks and separate dormitories. I find myself wondering honestly how a room full of educated men convinced themselves this particular leap was reasonable. Moving from an abstract worry about national population figures all the way down to physically separating one specific elderly couple in one specific ward on one specific evening for no reason beyond the theory printed in a pamphlet somewhere in London. That is the strange power of ideology, I suppose, once it fully settles into a bureaucracy. It stops asking whether an individual case actually fits the theory and starts simply applying the rule uniformly to every person unlucky enough to fall inside its reach. The system Edwin Chadwick's commission eventually settled on split every workhouse population into 7 distinct categories, not the simple 3 or 4 you might expect. Boys under 14, able-bodied men between 14 and 60, men over 60, girls under 14, able-bodied women between 14 and 60, women over 60, and infants who were permitted to remain with their mothers, but only until their 2nd birthday. 7 separate wards, 7 separate exercise yards in the more elaborate buildings, 7 completely different daily experiences sorted almost entirely by age and gender, rather than by the actual relationships that had, until that morning, defined a person's entire life. Notice too how precisely the numbers were chosen. 14, the age most working-class children were already expected to enter employment. 60, roughly the age the era considered a person's usefulness to have run its course. Even the boundaries of grief in this system were drawn along lines of economic productivity rather than anything resembling family. And it was not only husbands and wives this particular boundary line cut through. A father and his 14-year-old son who might have shared a bed, a trade, and an entire working life together, right up until the week they walked through that gate, were separated the very same afternoon the boy suddenly reclassified as an able-bodied man and marched off toward an entirely different wing of the building. No transition. No gradual loosening of the bond. One birthday on paper was apparently sufficient to end a childhood and dissolve a family in the exact same stroke of a clerk's pen. Think about that last detail for a second, the 2nd birthday. Somewhere inside these walls, a mother watched her child turn 2, an occasion that should have been a small, quiet celebration, and instead became the exact date on which the institution formally officially took that child away and placed him in a separate ward with dozens of other small boys he had never met. Not because anything had gone wrong, simply because a number on a birth record had finally caught up with the rulebook. I wonder sometimes whether any mother inside those walls ever tried to quietly forget her child's actual birthday, or lie about it to a clerk buying herself just a few more weeks of a small hand in hers before the calendar caught up regardless. Charles Dickens, writing not long after these rules took effect, captured the entire absurdity of it in a single biting sentence, observing that the new law, instead of compelling a man to support his family, took his family from him and made him a bachelor. I do not think Dickens intended that line purely as satire, though it certainly reads that way. He meant it as an accusation, and a fairly precise one. A system supposedly designed to strengthen the responsibilities of poor families had somehow arrived at the opposite outcome, entirely dissolving those very families the moment they needed help the most. It is a small irony worth noticing that a novelist working in fiction managed to describe the mechanics of this policy more honestly in a single sentence than most of the official reports produced by the men who actually wrote it. Now here is where I want to slow down for a story that tends to get skipped over in most retellings of this history, because I think it is one of the most quietly devastating chapters in the entire system, and it involves distances considerably longer than a single corridor. By the middle of the 1800s, several poor law unions had begun a practice that took family separation to a conclusion far beyond anything we've discussed so far. Destitute children, some of them still with a living parent somewhere back in England, were sent overseas, entirely shipped to British colonies in Canada and Australia under organised emigration schemes that framed the whole arrangement as an act of charity. Two women in particular, Maria Rye and Annie Macpherson, began organising these voyages in 1869, gathering groups of children from workhouses and orphanages, and placing them with farming families thousands of miles from anyone they had ever known. One single institution alone, the Philanthropic Farm School, sent more than 1,000 boys across the ocean between 1850 and 1871. Historians now refer to these children collectively as home children, a strangely gentle name for what was in practice a one-way voyage away from everything resembling home. The pitch made to the public at the time framed this almost as rescue an act of generosity toward children trapped in institutions with no future to speak of, given a fresh start amid open fields and honest farm work, far from the grime and shame of the workhouse gate. And for some children truly orphaned with no family left to claim them, perhaps that framing held some truth. But the word workhouse, remember, did not always mean orphan. It very often meant a family temporarily broken by circumstance, a parent inside recovering from illness or searching for work, fully intending to return for their children once life steadied itself again. For those families, this particular door swung shut with a permanence nothing else in this entire system quite matched. There was no chapel aisle to glimpse a familiar face across on a Sunday. There was an ocean, and in an era before telephones, before any realistic hope of return passage, an ocean functioned essentially the same as a locked door with no key anywhere in the building. Can I ask you something, actually? If you had a mother or a father who entered a workhouse during a difficult season of their life, fully intending to leave again once things improved, how would you feel discovering months later that your child had simply been placed on a ship and sent to a different continent while you were inside? Because that is precisely what happened to an unknown number of families. Some parents apparently consented under enormous pressure, believing sincerely that a farm in Ontario offered their child a better future than a ward inside that building. Others historians strongly suspect were never properly consulted at all. Their children quietly reclassified as orphans on a piece of paper that conveniently overlooked the fact that a mother or father was very much alive one building over on the exact same street. The receiving governments in Canada and Australia paid a small fee for each child delivered, and the labour of these children, once placed with colonial farming families, was expected to help offset the empire's own costs. Which means, if you sit with the full shape of this story, that family separation inside a British workhouse was never simply about wards and dormitories and chapel aisles. In its most extreme form, it became an actual transaction, a child's future quietly exchanged for a modest payment and one fewer name on a parish's expense ledger. There was, I should say, one small mercy carved into this otherwise unforgiving system, hard won rather than freely given. For years, elderly married couples fared no better than anyone else kept apart, regardless of how many decades they had already spent side by side, right up into their 70s and 80s. Picture a couple married since their 20s, having raised children, buried some survived harvests and fevers, and everything else. A long life throws at two people who chose to face it together, only to be told on the exact same afternoon that the parish had decided they would now sleep in separate wings for whatever years they had left. Public discomfort with that particular cruelty grew steadily louder through the 1840s, loud enough that officials eventually relented at least partially. The rule was relaxed to allow married couples over the age of 60 to share a room together if they wished it. It was not generosity exactly, more a grudging concession squeezed out by decades of quiet public shame. But for a husband and wife who had already survived 50 years of marriage, only to be threatened with spending their final ones apart, I imagine that small hard-won exception mattered rather more than the men who eventually granted it ever fully understood. And there is a rather telling irony sitting just underneath all of this one worth noticing before we move on. Records from St Marylebone Union in 1847 show that elderly people receiving outdoor relief, meaning help, while still living in their own homes, received a noticeably larger allowance if they were married rather than single 4 shillings a week for a couple, compared with 2 shillings for one person alone. Outside the workhouse gate, in other words, the system was perfectly willing to acknowledge that a married couple deserved to be treated and supported as a single unit, that 2 people sharing a household was simply more efficient, more humane, more sensible than forcing them to fend for themselves separately. The moment that same couple stepped through the gate itself, that entire principle simply evaporated. Apparently, marriage only counted as something worth protecting, for as long as the parish did not have to look at it up close, and did not have to pay for a slightly larger room to house it in. What strikes me most turning all of this over is how thoroughly the architects of this system understood exactly what they were dismantling. This was never simply bureaucratic indifference, the kind of accidental cruelty that comes from underfunding or overcrowding. It was a calculated belief that the family unit itself, the very thing most of us would call the centre of a meaningful life, was somehow part of the problem poverty needed to be cured of. Separate the parents so they cannot have more children. Separate the children so they might in theory grow into something other than what their parents had become. Ship them across an ocean if that separation needed reinforcing further still. It is a chilling kind of logic precisely because the men who designed it were not thinking of it as cruelty at all. They believed quite sincerely that they were engineering a better next generation, one broken family at a time. I keep coming back to a rather simple question as I sit with all of this, and I suspect you might be sitting with some version of it too. What does a society actually believe about poverty deep down if its solution to a struggling family is not support but disassembly? We tend to imagine cruelty as something loud, something obviously villainous. Most of what we've walked through together tonight was quieter than that. It was paperwork. It was policy. It was a bureaucrat's honest, sincere belief that he was solving a problem one signature at a time on forms that never once asked how a mother felt watching her toddler carried off to a different ward on his second birthday. And that raises the rather uncomfortable question we've been circling all along without quite landing on it yet. If the system was willing to go this far to reshape the adults, it had already judged and found lacking what exactly did it believe it was entitled to do with the children themselves, the ones too young to have done anything wrong at all, other than being born into the wrong family at the wrong moment in the wrong century. The answer, it turns out, was almost everything an adult would never have legally tolerated for themselves. Educate them on paper at least. Discipline them thoroughly and often with a cane. And when the parish decided a child had become more useful working than learning, hand that child over to a stranger for years at a time with a signature that required no consent from anyone the child actually loved. Childhood inside this system was never really treated as something to be protected. It was treated as a raw material, something to be shaped, corrected, and eventually put to use. Let's start with the schooling, because that is where the system's own promises and its actual practice pulled furthest apart from one another. Every workhouse was legally required to provide children with some form of education, reading, writing, basic arithmetic, alongside heavy doses of religious instruction, meant to keep young minds appropriately grateful and appropriately obedient. On paper, this sounds almost progressive for the era, a genuine attempt to break the cycle these children had been born into. In practice, the quality swung wildly from union to union. Some workhouses employed a dedicated schoolmaster or schoolmistress with real training and real patience. Others handed the job to whichever inmate happened to be literate enough to supervise a room of 40 or 50 children at once, with no formal teaching method beyond repetition and the threat of punishment for inattention. More than one historian looking back at surviving records has concluded that a startling number of children left these schools barely able to read their own name despite years spent technically enrolled. It is one thing to write a promise of education into law. It is quite another to fund it, staff it, and actually check whether anyone learned a single thing from it. Have you ever sat in a classroom at any point in your life where you could tell within the first week that nobody in charge actually expected you to succeed? I imagine more than a few of these children knew that particular feeling rather intimately, long before they were old enough to have the vocabulary for it. Health inside the children's wards brought its own particular misery, one that had nothing to do with hunger or labour at all. Ringworm, a highly contagious infection of the scalp, spread rapidly through crowded dormitories, where dozens of children shared combs, bedding, and close quarters night after night. The treatment was almost as unkind as the disease itself. A child's head would be shaved completely bald, then coated in iodine, a visible, unmistakable mark that instantly separated the afflicted from everyone around them. Children being children in any century that mark rarely stayed private, it became something to point at, something to laugh about, one more small humiliation layered on top of everything else a child in that building had already lost. Imagine being 7 or 8 years old, already stripped of your family, your clothes, your name in every practical sense, and then losing your hair too, in a way every other child in the room could see and comment on for weeks afterward until it finally grew back in. Punishment, meanwhile, followed its own grim ritual in more than a few of these institutions, particularly in the larger residential schools some unions built specifically to house their pauper children. At one such school, Friday mornings brought a formal punishment assembly, every boy lined up along 3 sides of a gymnasium to watch. For lesser offences, a boy was laid face down across a long desk, feet strapped in place, shirt pulled up, and struck several times with a long cane by a retired naval officer employed specifically for this purpose. For anything considered more serious, the birch replaced the cane entirely, and more than one boy needed to be carried out afterward for medical attention before he could even stand on his own. Notice how public this particular ritual was designed to be. This was not a private cell tucked away where nobody else could witness it. It was staged deliberately in front of every other child in the building, which tells you the punishment was never really meant only for the boy receiving it. It was meant for every set of eyes watching from the sidelines too, a weekly reminder of exactly what awaited anyone who stepped out of line. I want to introduce you to one particular boy who stood in that exact gymnasium on more than one of those Friday mornings, because I think his story belongs here more than almost anywhere else in this entire history, and because what he eventually built out of this childhood might be one of the more remarkable second acts you will hear about tonight. His name was Charles Chaplin, long before the world knew him as one of the most recognizable faces in the entire history of cinema. Before the bowler hat, the cane, the unmistakable waddling walk that made audiences on every continent laugh until they cried, he was simply a small undernourished boy from South London, sent into the workhouse system twice before his 9th birthday, his father absent, his mother struggling with poverty, and eventually her own mental health. His older half-brother Sidney walked the exact same path beside him, the two boys moving in and out of these institutions together whenever their mother's circumstances collapsed, which meant that whatever happened to one brother, in a very real sense, happened to both. At the Central London District School, the very institution running those Friday punishment assemblies, young Charlie once received 3 strokes of the cane for an offence the record itself suggests he likely had not even committed. He also caught ringworm during his time there, his head shaved and treated exactly the way we just described. One more indignity, added to a childhood that had already collected far more than its fair share. He was by every measure available to the officials cataloguing him, at the time simply another entry in a ledger, another pauper child indistinguishable from hundreds of others passing through those same corridors that same year. Here is where I want you to pause with me for a moment, because I think this is worth truly sitting with rather than rushing past. That same small boy humiliated in front of a gymnasium full of other children, his scalp marked with iodine, punished for things he had not done, grew into a man whose most famous creation, a shabby, dignified little tramp in ill-fitting clothes, wandering through a hostile world with nothing but resilience and a stubborn refusal to stop trying, became one of the most beloved characters the 20th century ever produced. The psychologist Sigmund Freud once remarked that Chaplin in every film he ever made seemed to be playing some version of himself exactly as he had been in that dismal, difficult youth. And when Chaplin eventually directed a film about an abandoned child clinging to a struggling guardian in a hostile city called simply The Kid, he was not inventing that particular ache from imagination. He was drawing it directly from memory, from a gymnasium, from a shaved and iodine-stained scalp, from every quiet indignity a small boy absorbs long before he has the words to explain why any of it hurt as much as it did. Have you ever noticed how often the people who eventually make us laugh the hardest turn out to be carrying something rather heavy underneath it? I do not think that is a coincidence, honestly, not after spending as much time with this history as I have. There is a particular kind of resilience that only gets built under exactly this sort of pressure, and Chaplin's entire career, in a strange way, became a lifelong conversation with the small boy who once stood in that punishment line, still finding a way decades later to make the whole world smile because of him rather than at him. It is, I think, one of the more quietly remarkable transformations in this entire story, A boy whose scalp was once marked for public ridicule, growing into a man whose face decades later became one of the most beloved and recognized on the entire planet, purely on the strength of his own talent and stubbornness. His own biographer would later describe his journey as one of the most dramatic rags to riches stories ever told, and having spent this much time inside the actual rags in question, I find it difficult to disagree. It is worth remembering too that nothing about this outcome was inevitable. For every child who managed to turn a punishing childhood into fuel for something extraordinary, countless others simply carried the weight of it quietly for the rest of their lives, with no stage, no camera, and no worldwide audience waiting to applaud whatever they managed to build out of the wreckage. Before Chaplin's story, and long before the Victorian Workhouse, we have spent this entire evening inside an even darker fate, awaited many pauper children under the older system this whole institution was built to replace. In the 1770s, a reformer named Jonah Hanway investigated conditions in London's parish workhouses and uncovered numbers that are honestly difficult to say out loud. In one workhouse, 68 out of 76 children died within a single year. In another, 16 out of 18. A third workhouse, according to his findings, had not seen a single child survive a full year in 14 years running. Children who did survive were often apprenticed out as young as 6 or 7, frequently to master chimney sweeps sent climbing inside narrow burning flues that occasionally killed them outright when they lost their way in the dark and suffocated before anyone realized they were missing. A master sweep would sometimes keep a dozen or more of these small apprentices at once, paid a flat fee by the parish for each child taken off its books, and once the papers were signed, oversight essentially ended. Whatever happened to that child afterward became quite literally nobody's official concern. Try to picture the physics of it for a moment. A child small enough to fit inside a chimney, barely wider than his own shoulders, climbing blind through soot and darkness, using nothing but elbows and knees braced against brick, while somewhere below, an adult who had paid a few pounds for the privilege waited for him to reappear. The 1834 reforms we've spent so much time discussing tonight, whatever else you think of them, were partly built as a direct response to exactly this horror, and the men who designed the new system explicitly stated their intention to move away from apprenticing workhouse children out to strangers with little oversight. It did not disappear entirely, and it did not disappear quickly, but the shift was real. Records from the Norwich workhouse show that between 1834 and 1863 roughly 130 boys were still apprenticed out into various trades, though the overwhelming majority, about 80 out of every 100, went into something considerably gentler than a chimney flue: shoemaking, a skill a young man might actually carry forward into an honest, sustainable trade, rather than a job that regularly killed the children sent to perform it. Progress in this particular corner of the story arrived slowly, unevenly, and never completely, but it did eventually arrive. So that is the rather complicated shape of childhood inside this system. An education that sometimes worked and often did not. A disease that marked you publicly for something entirely outside your control. A punishment ritual severe enough to leave grown men writing about it decades later. And underneath all of it, faintly the ghost of an even crueler era the system had been built at least in part to leave behind, even if it never fully managed to escape its shadow. Chaplin's story survives because he became famous enough for historians to bother preserving it. I want to be honest with you about something, though, before we move on. For every Charlie Chaplin whose childhood eventually got written down in biographies and studied by film scholars, there were thousands of children who passed through these exact same schools, these exact same punishment assemblies, these exact same shaved and iodine-stained scalps, and simply vanished from the historical record entirely. no biography, no Hollywood career to retroactively justify the interest. Just a name on an admission ledger, and then eventually nothing at all. It is worth remembering that Chaplin's story is remarkable precisely because it survived, not because his suffering was somehow rarer or worse than anyone else's sitting in that same gymnasium beside him. And unlike Chaplin, who at least arrived at that gate with a mother beside him, and some memory of a life that came before it, a considerable number of the children we've been discussing tonight never knew any life outside these walls at all. They were born there inside the workhouse infirmary, the very first breath they ever took happening inside a building. Most of the country regarded as a last resort for the desperate. For those children, there was no Chapel Isle memory to hold on to, no home to compare the institution against and find lacking. The workhouse simply was the entire world from the very first day, and that particular kind of beginning belonged almost entirely to a group of women this system was about to treat with a very specific, very deliberate kind of cruelty, the sort we have not yet spent any real time with tonight, and the sort that begins the moment a woman is discovered to be carrying a child she has no husband to claim beside her. They were about to discover that the law itself had already decided whose fault this was long before any of them had walked through that gate. And once you understand exactly how that law was written, you start to see this entire chapter of the story a little differently, less as a series of individual misfortunes, and more as the predictable, almost mathematical result of a policy built on a very particular kind of blame. Buried inside the same 1834 Act we've spent so much of tonight examining sits a set of provisions history now calls the bastardy clauses, and if the name sounds harsh, that is because the reality behind it was harsher still. Before this law existed, an unmarried mother in England had at least some practical recourse. She could name the father in front of a local magistrate at a fairly accessible court close to home, and that magistrate held real power to force him towards some form of financial support. It was messy. It was imperfect. But it worked often enough to matter, and it rested on a fairly simple, fairly reasonable premise that two people had created a child together, and two people ought to share some responsibility for raising it. The new law dismantled nearly all of it in one stroke. Responsibility for an illegitimate child now rested entirely exclusively on the mother until that child turned 16 years old. The father owed nothing legally and could walk away entirely clean. If a woman still wanted to pursue him for support, she could no longer simply visit a local magistrate. Her case now had to be heard at a county quarter sessions, a court considerably more expensive and far less accessible, and she needed something the law called corroboration. In some material particular meaning, her own word on its own was no longer considered sufficient evidence of who had fathered her child. Think about what that actually demands. A woman needed independent proof of a private act that by its very nature rarely happens in front of a witness. The bar was not simply raised, it was set quite deliberately somewhere close to impossible. Parliament's own reasoning at the time was almost breathtakingly blunt. Make the consequences of an extramarital pregnancy unpleasant enough, the thinking went, and women would simply choose to avoid it. As though desperation, poverty, coercion, and plain human loneliness could all be legislated out of existence with a sufficiently unpleasant law. It is a strange kind of faith when you think about it. The belief that a woman weighing an unplanned pregnancy is pausing to consult the fine print of a poor law statute before making any of the choices that actually led her there in the first place. Here is where I want to tell you about a woman named Margaret Wheatley, because her story, more than almost any statistic I could offer you, shows you exactly what that law actually cost. In Newcastle, in 1843, Margaret was 22 years old, unmarried and pregnant without the money to pay for a midwife. Poor law authorities offered her medical assistance. She refused it. Historians studying her case believe the shame attached to accepting that help and the fear of what accepting it might lead to outweighed in her mind the danger of going without any medical care at all during childbirth. She died giving birth alone, having chosen that outcome over the alternative this system offered her. Sit with the arithmetic of that decision for a moment, because I do not think it was irrational, however tragic it turned out to be. Margaret was weighing two real dangers against each other: the physical risk of childbirth, without any trained assistance, against the social and institutional consequences of accepting parish help. The yellow or red mark that might follow her afterward, the loss of whatever reputation she still had left, possibly the workhouse itself waiting on the other side of that acceptance. She looked at both paths and decided the second one frightened her more. That is not a story about one unlucky young woman making a poor choice. That is a story about a system so thoroughly stacked against her that death in her own calculation seemed like the less punishing option. Can I ask you something? Honestly, what does it say about an institution when a young woman would rather risk dying than accept its help? Because that is not simply a tragic individual choice. That is a verdict on the entire system surrounding her, delivered in the most final way a person can possibly deliver one. The stigma did not stop at the courtroom door either. It followed women physically visibly into the workhouse itself. In Bristol, during the 1830s, records show that women identified as prostitutes were made to wear a yellow dress, while unmarried pregnant women were placed in red. A colour-coded system of public shame stitched directly into the fabric these women were forced to wear every single day. Imagine walking through a dining hall or a laundry room instantly identifiable to every single person around you, not by anything you had said or done that morning, but by the colour the parish had decided your body's history deserved to broadcast. The practice grew common enough and controversial enough that the Poor Law Commissioners themselves eventually stepped in, issuing a formal order in 1839 specifically condemning what they called ignominious dress for unchaste women in workhouses. It is worth noting, and I think it says something important, that even the men who designed this famously unforgiving system looked at this particular practice and decided it had gone a step too far, officially condemning something and actually ending it. However, turned out to be two very different accomplishments. At the Mitford and Launditch Workhouse, in a small Norfolk town called Gressenhall, unmarried mothers continued being singled out through a distinctive jacket made from the same rough material as the standard uniform, but cut and styled just differently enough to mark the wearer instantly to anyone who knew what to look for. Local records show these women being referred to quite openly as jacket women, and the practice continued for nearly 3 more decades after the central authorities had already declared it unacceptable, finally fading out only around 1866. A rule can be written and rewritten in London as many times as officials like. Whether it actually changes anything in a workhouse dining hall 300 miles away always depended on people who were never in that London room. To begin with a pattern I would remind you, we've already noticed once tonight in an entirely different corner of this story. Now faced with a law that offered them almost nothing, and a stigma that followed them everywhere, they turned. Many unmarried mothers found themselves forced into an arrangement history remembers as baby farming, and I want to walk you through this carefully because it is one of the more quietly devastating threads in this entire story. Domestic service was often the only respectable employment available to a working woman, and virtually no household would hire a servant who also had a child to care for. So a mother would pay another woman, often a stranger advertising in a local paper, to feed house and raise her child, while she went out to earn the wages that were supposedly meant to support that same child. It was in its own way an entire shadow economy built on exactly the gap this law had opened up, women paying other women to solve a problem the state had flatly refused to help with. A young woman named Laura Clark from a small village in Cornwall lived through almost exactly this pattern. Forced to leave home in disgrace once her pregnancy became visible, she resettled somewhere she was not known, gave birth, and then handed her infant over to a baby farmer so she could take up domestic service and actually earn a living. Her child died not long afterward. Laura's story was tragically common rather than exceptional. Some baby farmers were decent, overworked women doing their honest best with too little money and too many mouths to feed. Others, investigators later discovered, took in far more infants than they could possibly care for, properly collected their fees regardless, and quietly let nature take a rather convenient course. It would take until the early 1860s for a group of concerned physicians to finally raise a serious alarm about infant mortality rates among these informally fostered children, forcing the first real conversations about regulating an industry that had until then operated almost entirely in the shadows, hidden behind newspaper advertisements and closed front doors nobody in authority ever thought to knock on. Public reaction to all of this was not universally silent, I should say, even at the time. A political cartoon from August of 1834 made the round showing a prominent lord literally kicking a pregnant woman, while a bishop and a disapproving older woman cheer him on with a long queue of other pregnant women turned away at the door of what the cartoon mockingly labelled the National Delivery House. It is a startlingly cruel image to look at now, and I suspect it was drawn precisely to be startling, since gentle criticism rarely moves anyone to actually reconsider a law already passed. Satire once again doing the work that polite conversation apparently could not. Somebody looked at this new law, sized up exactly who it was punishing and who it was quietly letting off the hook, and decided the whole arrangement deserved to be mocked in print for the entire country to see. Beyond the dress itself, this moral sorting shaped where a woman actually slept and worked inside the building day after day. Guardians in many unions drew a careful, unofficial line between what they termed women of good character and everyone else, and that line decided everything from which dormitory you were assigned to which women you were permitted to sit beside during meals. A widow respectably bereaved through no fault of her own might find herself housed alongside the elderly and infirm, treated with something resembling ordinary dignity. An unmarried mother, regardless of the circumstances that had actually led to her pregnancy, whether it was a broken promise of marriage, a master's abuse of a servant with no power to refuse him, or simple heartbreak, was frequently placed in a separate section, entirely her presence there, functioning as a kind of standing warning to every other woman in the building about exactly where certain choices or certain misfortunes might lead. The workhouse, in other words, was not simply sorting inmates by age and ability the way we discussed earlier tonight. For women specifically, it was also quietly sorting by virtue, as judged, of course, entirely by men who would never themselves face a single consequence for the exact same private failing. And that, I think, is really the heart of what made this particular corner of the system so quietly infuriating more than a century removed from it. A man could father a child outside of marriage and walk away with his reputation, his income and his freedom completely intact. The woman carrying that same child inherited the entire weight of it alone. The shame, the yellow dress, or the red one, or the telltale jacket, the workhouse gate. And very often, as Margaret Wheatley's story shows us, the actual physical risk of dying rather than asking for the help this system technically claimed to offer. It was never really about morality, whatever language the law dressed itself in. It was about who this society had decided was allowed to make a mistake, and who would be made to pay for it for the rest of her life. I find myself thinking honestly about how many versions of this exact imbalance still echo in conversations happening today, dressed in more modern language argued in different rooms, but built on remarkably similar assumptions about who bears the visible cost of a shared circumstance. I will not pretend that observation is uniquely mine. Historians have been making it for decades, but sitting with Margaret Wheatley's story and Laura Clark's and every jacket woman whose name never made it into any surviving record at all, it is difficult not to notice how familiar the underlying shape of it still feels. We've spent this evening walking through hunger and labour and separation and shame, each one, its own particular cruelty contained mostly within the walls of whichever workhouse happened to be enforcing it. Different buildings, different guardians, different degrees of severity depending entirely on who happened to be holding the keys that particular year. But there is one story left in this history, where nearly all of these threads, the hunger we described earlier, the desperate punishing labour, the callous indifference of men who never had to live with their own decisions, collided at once inside a single building on a single set of records that eventually landed on the desk of Parliament itself. What happened there didn't stay contained the way most of what we've discussed tonight managed to. It forced the entire country to finally stop and ask in the plainest possible terms exactly how far this system had been allowed to go before anyone in power was willing to admit it had gone too far. The story that finally forced that question begins in a small market town in Hampshire called Andover, inside a boneyard we've already visited once tonight. Though I deliberately did not tell you everything about it at the time, I wanted you to meet it properly here where it actually belongs with the full weight of what it eventually became. By 1845, bone crushing had been standard labour at the Andover Union Workhouse for years. The same task we described earlier, heavy iron rammers, heaps of old animal bones, the whole grim business of turning slaughterhouse waste into fertiliser. What made Andover different was not the task itself. It was how far the hunger surrounding that task had already gone quietly for months, before anyone with any real power bothered to ask a single question about it. The man who finally asked was a local guardian named Hugh Mundy, a farmer with something of a reputation among his fellow landowners, mostly because he insisted on paying his own labourers 2 shillings more a week than everyone else in the district thought necessary. Make of that what you will about the kind of man he was. In February of that year, Mundy stood up at a routine board meeting and repeated a rumour that had been circulating quietly through the town, that paupers assigned to bone crushing were eating the marrow and gristle, still clinging to the bones before they crushed them. The board, by most accounts, simply did not want to believe him. Rumours like that are uncomfortable. They are much easier to wave away than to investigate. Mundy refused to let it go. He convinced a handful of the more doubtful guardians to accompany him directly to the workhouse and question the paupers themselves face to face, without the master filtering the conversation first. 10 or 12 men were brought forward. Every one of them confirmed it. They told Mundy and his colleagues that they fought each other over the freshest bones when a new batch arrived, hiding the better ones to keep other men from claiming them first, and that when hunger got bad enough they ate the marrow regardless of whether the bones were fresh or already rotting. Regardless. Read that word again for a moment, because it is doing an enormous amount of quiet, horrifying work in that sentence. Even with paupers confirming it to their faces, the board's response amounted to almost nothing. They suspended bone crushing during the hottest weeks of summer, apparently on the theory that heat alone was the problem, and otherwise left the entire system exactly as it was. Have you ever watched a group of people presented with clear, direct evidence of something deeply wrong, and chosen the smallest possible response instead of the honest one? I imagine you have. It is one of the more depressingly consistent patterns in human institutions then and now. Mundy, to his credit, did not stop there either. He carried the story to his local Member of Parliament, a man named Thomas Wackley, who happened to be the founder of a respected medical journal and had built something of a reputation for challenging institutional cover-ups wherever he found them. On the 1st of August 1845, Wackley stood up in the House of Commons and asked the Home Secretary directly whether he was aware that paupers in Andover were quarrelling over bones extracting marrow and gnawing meat from them. The Home Secretary's first instinct apparently was disbelief, though he did promise to look into it. History, rather unkindly, also remembers him later dismissing the entire affair as merely a workhouse squabble 4 words that aged about as badly as any 4 words possibly could. An assistant commissioner named Henry Parker was dispatched to Andover almost immediately, and within days he confirmed that the allegations were in fact largely true. Worse digging further, Parker discovered something the original rumour had not even touched. Inmates had also been receiving less than their legally required ration of bread quietly, consistently for some time. Hunger, in other words, was not simply driving men to gnaw old bones out of some isolated desperation. It had been engineered in part by rations that were already falling short of what the law itself demanded. By November of that year, the Central Poor Law Commissioners finally issued a formal order banning bone crushing across every workhouse in the country, a quiet official admission that the practice had gone badly, dangerously wrong. But the timing tells you something important. That ban came 3 months after Parliament had already been publicly told about it, and roughly 9 months after Hugh Mundy first raised the alarm at a local board meeting. Nobody wanted to take seriously. What happened next turned an already ugly local scandal into a genuine national crisis, and this is where a name you already know from earlier tonight walks back into the story. When the commissioners dismissed Parker, the very investigator who had uncovered the truth and then forced a second assistant commissioner named William Day to resign shortly afterward under rather flimsy circumstances, public sympathy shifted hard against the commission itself. Edwin Chadwick, the same man we met building the intellectual architecture of this entire system back at the very beginning of tonight's story, had by this point fallen out of favour with his fellow commissioners and was by most accounts still nursing considerable resentment over it. He quietly encouraged sympathetic members of Parliament to keep pressing the issue rather than letting it fade. The architect of the system, in other words, ended up helping light the fuse that would eventually help bring a piece of his own creation crashing down. History does enjoy the occasional twist of irony, and this one is difficult to improve upon. On the 5th of March 1846, the House of Commons formally established a select committee, 15 members strong, tasked with investigating the Andover Union in full, along with the wider conduct of the Poor Law Commission itself. What followed was months of testimony, eventually filling 2 enormous printed volumes running to several thousand pages, and some of the surviving exchanges between the committee and its witnesses are almost unbearable to read even now. One exchange in particular has stayed with me since I first came across it. A committee member asked a former inmate whether the smell in the bone room had been very bad. It had the man answered. Asked whether it had affected his health, he said it had and that it seemed to affect the other men as well. Asked directly whether he had ever seen anyone eat something from those bones, he answered simply that he had seen them eat marrow. Asked whether they explained why he said he believed they were simply very hungry. And when asked whether he himself had felt that same hunger, he admitted that he had, though his own stomach, in his words, would not take it. He could not bring himself to swallow it, even starving. I find that particular detail almost more devastating than anything else in the entire record, the quiet difference between a man hungry enough to want to and a body that simply refuses. The rammer itself, witnesses confirmed, weighed close to 28 solid pounds, swung down again and again inside a wooden bone tub, in a room so close and poorly ventilated that more than one man described genuine difficulty breathing by the end of a shift. But bone crushing, it turned out, was only the most visible piece of something considerably darker, running through the entire institution, the sort of thing a rumour about marrow and gristle could never fully capture on its own. The workhouse master, a former army sergeant major named Colin MacDougall, a veteran who had actually fought at Waterloo decades earlier, emerged through testimony as something closer to a small tyrant than a caretaker. Witnesses described him as prone to drunken rages, quick to strike inmates with his fists or whatever object happened to be nearby, including disturbingly some of the elderly and infirm men least able to defend themselves. Female inmates testified to sexual abuse committed by MacDougall, and according to some accounts by his own son as well, an accusation made all the more chilling by how casually the guardians overseeing the institution had apparently chosen to look away from it for years. As punishment for various infractions, some paupers were locked quite literally inside the workhouse mortuary, left alone among the dead as a form of discipline. I will let that image sit exactly where it lands, because I do not think it needs any further commentary from me. The financial abuse ran just as deep once investigators started actually checking the numbers against what the law required, and there is a particular kind of cruelty and fraud dressed up as bureaucracy that I think deserves its own moment of attention. An elderly man named William Norris, 76 years old, spent 21 days in the workhouse, legally entitled to a weekly allowance of tea, sugar butter, and ale extras, specifically owed to the aged under the union's own dietary rules. He received none of it, while the parish's own ledgers still recorded the expense, as though he had meaning somewhere on paper. A comfortable old man was being fed things a real old man 3 weeks running never once tasted. Another case involved a man named Richard Smith, confined with a broken leg, given nothing beyond the standard ration, except a small allowance of beer during his final week. Perhaps most quietly damning of all, one woman's husband later discovered that after his wife died inside the workhouse, her weekly allowance had continued being charged to the ratepayers for 3 full days following her death money that quite obviously never once reached her. Somebody signed that ledger entry. Somebody looked at a dead woman's name and quietly decided her allowance was still worth claiming. The institution's own medical officer, a man named Westlake, later admitted under questioning that he had long suspected mistreatment, but had said nothing out of fear for his own position, and out of a genuine belief that the master's influence over the board of guardians was strong enough to make any complaint from him seem, in his own words, presumptuous. Between 1837 and 1846 records show that 61 separate paupers from Andover ended up in prison, and historians studying the case now believe a meaningful number of them likely committed minor offences on purpose, specifically to escape the workhouse regime choosing an actual criminal sentence over another day inside those walls. Think about the particular kind of desperation required for prison to start looking comparatively like relief. The Select Committee's final report, published in August of 1846, criticised nearly everyone connected to the affair, the MacDougalls as entirely unfit for their positions, the local guardians for failing even to visit the institution they were legally responsible for overseeing, the commission itself for its clumsy defensive handling of the entire crisis. And yet, despite everything uncovered, despite the physical abuse, despite the sexual abuse, despite the mortuary confinements, no criminal charges were ever brought against Colin MacDougall. He lost his position. That was in the end the entire consequence he faced. The larger consequence landed somewhere else entirely. The 3-man Poor Law Commission, nicknamed rather bitterly by critics as the 3 Kings of Somerset House, had already spent a full decade governing the fate of hundreds of thousands of the country's poorest citizens with remarkably little direct accountability to Parliament, exactly the kind of unchecked centralised power we spent time examining earlier tonight. When the legislation extending the Commission's authority came up for renewal in 1847, Parliament simply declined to renew it. In its place rose the Poor Law Board, still overseeing the same system, still enforcing most of the same principles, but now headed by a president who sat directly in Parliament and could be questioned publicly by name whenever the next Andover inevitably surfaced somewhere else in the country. And it did surface again more than once in the years that followed, a quiet reminder that changing the org chart at the very top rarely fixes what actually goes wrong at the very bottom, in a boneyard, in a locked mortuary, in a dietary ledger nobody thought to check. What strikes me most about Andover even now is how ordinary its beginning actually was. Not a dramatic uprising, not a crusading journalist kicking down a door, simply one guardian mildly more decent than his colleagues, who happened to take a rumour seriously instead of shrugging it off the way everyone around him clearly preferred to. Systems this large rarely collapse from some single spectacular blow. They erode slowly from one uncomfortable question. Somebody finally refuses to stop asking, repeated often enough and loudly enough that everyone else eventually finds it harder to look away than to actually listen. I think about Hugh Mundy rather often honestly turning this story over. He was not a radical. He was not even particularly popular among his fellow guardians, most of whom seemed to regard him as something of a nuisance for paying his own labourers a fairer wage than local custom demanded. He simply noticed something wrong, and unlike nearly everyone else in that room, declined to let it go quietly. It is a small, unglamorous kind of courage, the sort that rarely gets a statue built for it, and yet an entire national system of oversight arguably changed shape, because one farmer in Hampshire refused to accept an easy rumour as an easy dismissal, and Andover, as shocking as it was, still only tells you what happened to people society had at the very least agreed to keep alive. There was an entire other category of workhouse life we have barely touched tonight, the sick, the dying, and the ones who never left that building standing up at all, and the infirmary wards where they spent their final days were in their own quiet way, keeping secrets every bit as troubling as anything a boneyard in Hampshire ever revealed. Let's step inside that infirmary properly, because for a considerable portion of the people who ever passed through a workhouse gate, it was the last room they ever occupied, and I think it deserves a fuller telling than most retellings of this history bother giving it. By the later decades of this system's life, the sick wards of a typical union workhouse were not treating occasional injuries or seasonal fevers. They were in effect functioning as the hospital of last resort for an entire class of people. No private doctor particularly wanted as a patient the elderly, the chronically ill, the disabled, anyone whose body had simply worn out from decades of exactly the kind of labour we described earlier tonight. In many of the larger cities, the workhouse infirmary had effectively become the busiest hospital in the entire district, whether the parish advertised that fact or not, simply because it was the only door still open to people. Every other institution had already turned away, and the people caring for them for most of this system's history had received no formal medical training whatsoever. Early nursing inside these infirmaries fell almost entirely to able-bodied female inmates themselves, women serving their own workhouse sentence, who were simply assigned to the sick ward as another form of labour alongside laundry and oakum picking. Some approached the work with genuine tenderness. Many, by every surviving account, were simply exhausted, undertrained, and occasionally drunk on whatever they could obtain, since nobody had thought to prevent it, and nobody was paying them enough to particularly care. At one of the largest infirmaries in the entire country, records from the 1860s Describe a single nurse responsible for as many as 100 patients at once. Sit with that ratio for a moment. One woman, untrained, unpaid, or barely paid, walking a ward of 100 sick and dying strangers, expected somehow to notice who needed water, who needed turning, who had quietly stopped breathing sometime in the night. Reformers pushing for change at the time, physicians and campaigners alike pointed to exactly this arrangement again and again as the single clearest proof that something inside this system needed to change. Not the theory of it, but the actual hands touching actual patients at 3 a.m. The doctors overseeing all of this, where a union bothered employing one at all, worked under their own particular set of perverse incentives. Many medical officers were paid a flat annual salary regardless of how many patients passed through their care, which meant a conscientious doctor and a neglectful one earned exactly the same income for wildly different amounts of actual attention given. Some medical officers spread across several parishes at once might be responsible for hundreds of patients scattered across multiple buildings, visiting each ward only briefly once or twice a week, leaving the actual hour-to-hour care entirely in the hands of whichever untrained inmate happened to be assigned that day. It was a system almost perfectly engineered to reward the bare minimum of effort, and more than a few doctors, to their credit, still exceeded it anyway, simply because they could not bring themselves to do otherwise. It took a rather unlikely combination of people to finally start changing the nursing side of that equation, and I think their story deserves more attention than it usually gets. A Liverpool merchant named William Rathbone, disturbed by exactly the conditions we just described, began funding trained nursing care for the poor in his own district, and eventually wrote to Florence Nightingale herself for advice on how to properly reform the workhouse infirmary at Brownlow Hill, one of the largest in the country. Nightingale, interestingly, did not immediately leap at the cause with open enthusiasm. She reportedly described workhouse inmates in a private remark that has not aged particularly well as more untamable than lions. Even the most celebrated reformer of her era, it seems, walked into this project carrying some of the same prejudices everyone else around her held. Progress, historically speaking, rarely arrives from people who are already perfectly enlightened. It often arrives from people who manage to act rightly anyway, despite whatever private doubts they were still carrying. On Nightingale's recommendation, a woman named Agnes Jones took the job as matron, leading 12 professionally trained nurses into Brownlow Hill Infirmary in 1865, backed by 18 additional trainees and dozens more paid pauper assistants working alongside them. What she found on arrival was, by her own account, close to unbearable. Within the first month alone, 35 of the existing pauper nurses had to be dismissed for drunkenness. Filth, by every surviving description, was simply universal ground into the floors, the bedding, the walls themselves. Jones and her small team spent months rebuilding the entire operation essentially from nothing, training new staff, enforcing basic sanitation, insisting on standards nobody in that building had ever been asked to meet before. She developed her own system of supervision, sometimes called shepherding, where a single trained head nurse oversaw a small group of assistants and their patients directly, rather than leaving one exhausted woman to somehow watch an entire ward alone. Have you ever taken on a task so overwhelming that you almost regretted saying yes to it, only to keep going anyway because walking away felt somehow worse? By most accounts, that describes fairly precisely how Agnes Jones felt about Brownlow Hill in her early months there. She was not, by her own private admission, especially enthusiastic about the assignment, and yet she stayed, and the infirmary she eventually built became something close to a genuine hospital, a model other unions across the country slowly began copying in the years that followed. Jones died only 3 years later in 1868, having contracted typhoid fever from the very patient she had spent those years caring for. She was 35 years old. I do not think it is an exaggeration to say she gave her own life quite literally to the people this system had spent decades treating as barely worth the trouble. Even with reformers like Jones slowly changing the picture, death remained a constant quiet presence inside these buildings, and what happened to a person's body afterward tells you almost as much about this system as anything we have discussed so far tonight. Have you ever thought about how a society treats its dead as a kind of mirror, reflecting exactly how it treated those same people while they were still breathing? I think about that a great deal working through records like these. A pauper without family able to pay for burial was interred at the parish's expense in a communal plot, without a headstone, without much ceremony at all, often stacked several bodies deep in ground the parish had chosen specifically because nobody wealthy enough to complain wanted to be buried anywhere near it. Charles Dickens, who we've already met once tonight in an entirely different context, captured this particular indignity with characteristic precision in a novel many of you likely already know, describing a pauper funeral attended by almost nobody, local children playing games among the very tombstones, while the coffin waited to be lowered. It is a small, almost throwaway detail in his writing, and I think that is precisely the point he was making. Death for the poorest people in Victorian England had become so routine, so administratively unremarkable, that nobody around it particularly bothered to treat it as sacred anymore. But there is a considerably darker layer sitting just beneath even that quiet indignity, one I think deserves careful, honest attention, because it connects directly back to a man we've already spent real time with tonight. In 1832, Parliament passed the Anatomy Act, a law responding to genuine public horror over grave robbers supplying medical schools with stolen corpses, a grim trade that had terrified ordinary families for decades. The solution lawmakers settled on was almost breathtakingly convenient for everyone except the people it actually affected. Anybody left unclaimed by relatives within a set window after death, typically somewhere between 48 hours and a few weeks, depending on the institution, could now be legally handed over to a medical school for dissection instead of buried. And the primary source of these unclaimed bodies, quite deliberately, was expected to be prisons, asylums and workhouses, the exact same buildings we've spent this entire evening walking through together. Think about what that actually meant for a family too poor to afford a funeral. Claiming your own mother's body meant accepting responsibility for burial costs you likely could not afford in the first place. Failing to claim it, whether from genuine poverty or simply not being notified in time, could mean her body ending up on a dissection table instead of in the ground, her final resting place delayed by months, while she was quite literally taken apart for the education of medical students who would never know her name, never learn a single detail of the life she'd actually lived. One case from Great Yarmouth in 1900, and 1 decade after this system's supposed reforms, had softened so much of what we discussed earlier tonight, shows exactly how this arrangement could curdle into outright fraud. A pauper named Frank Hyde died in the local workhouse. The official death register recorded that he had been buried by friends 5 days after his death. He had not been. His body, according to a local newspaper investigation that caused genuine public outrage, had actually been sent to Cambridge for dissection, and the workhouse master's own clerk had personally profited 15 shillings from arranging the sale. The paperwork, in other words, was not simply careless. It was a deliberate lie written down calmly in an official register specifically to hide exactly where a dead man's body had actually gone. A subsequent inquiry discovered that between 1880 and 1900 126 bodies from that single workhouse had been sold to the very same medical school, most of them presumably with paperwork just as quietly falsified as Frank Hyde's. The investigation that followed concluded rather conveniently that the case was an isolated, unusual incident, a conclusion historians examining the surviving records now consider almost certainly untrue. Once you understand how quietly profitable this particular arrangement could be for the officials involved, one clerk pocketing 15 shillings here, another union saving the cost of an entire funeral, there it becomes considerably harder to believe Frank Hyde was ever really an exception, rather than simply the one case that happened to get caught. Here is a small strange footnote to all of this that I find almost impossible not to mention. Jeremy Bentham, the same philosopher whose panopticon principle shaped the entire surveillance-based architecture of these buildings, actually died that same year. The Anatomy Act passed and specifically requested that his own body be publicly dissected in the name of scientific progress, a wish carried out by a close friend in front of an invited audience. His preserved remains dressed in his own clothes, seated upright, his own walking stick resting beside him, still sit today inside a wooden cabinet at University College London, watched over by students and visitors who have no legal obligation to be there at all. The man who believed poverty deserved careful, deliberate surveillance chose for himself an afterlife of complete transparency, fully consenting, fully documented, treated with something bordering on reverence, his name still attached to every part of the arrangement. The paupers whose bodies quietly disappeared into the very same medical schools received no such choice, and considerably less reverence in almost every recorded case, their names more often than not quietly separated from their own remains somewhere along the way. That, I think, is really the cruelest arithmetic sitting underneath this entire chapter of the story. Poverty followed a person all the way to the end of their life, and then for an unknown number of them kept right on following their body afterward into a laboratory onto a dissection table, before whatever remained was finally allowed to rest sometimes months or even years later than it should have. It is worth remembering too that most of the families affected by this never knew, never had reason to suspect, and simply carried a quiet, unresolved grief for a burial they believed had happened properly on the exact day the register claimed it had. There is a particular kind of loneliness in that grieving a death you never got to properly witness the ending of mourning a grave that for weeks or months did not actually contain the person you thought it did. We have spent tonight walking through hunger and labour and family and shame and finally death itself, each one a different way this system decided who deserved comfort and who did not. But there is one more group we have not yet given proper attention, to people this institution treated with an almost casual coldness, even by the standards we've already discussed, because the system never even considered them permanent enough to deserve real consideration in the first place. They arrived after dark, stayed exactly one night, and were gone again before most other inmates had even woken to notice they had been there at all. These were the vagrants, the tramps people with no fixed parish, no settled home, walking from town to town in search of work that rarely materialized, sleeping under hedges when the weather allowed it, and knocking on a workhouse gate when it did not. The law had a specific, rather cold term for them, the casual poor. And the wing of the workhouse, built to hold them separate from everyone we've discussed so far tonight, kept apart deliberately from the settled inmates whose full lives we have spent this evening walking through, earned its own grim nickname among the very people forced to use it. They called it the Spike. Understand first why a tramp needed that gate at all, because it was not simply a matter of preference. Under the Vagrancy Act of 1824, sleeping outdoors or begging without shelter was quite literally a criminal offence. A person caught doing either risked arrest and up to 2 weeks of hard labour in an actual prison, which meant that for the poorest, most rootless people in the entire country, walking through a casual ward's door every single night was not really a choice at all. It was the only legal alternative to a jail cell. Freedom for a tramp was really only a choice between two different kinds of confinement, and most understandably picked the one that came with a roof. The routine, once you understand it, reveals a system built specifically for people the parish never expected to see twice. Tramps began queuing outside the gate from late afternoon, sometimes for hours, since a spike only held so many beds, and latecomers were simply turned away to find somewhere else or nowhere at all. Once admitted, you were searched thoroughly for alcohol, matches, tobacco, anything the master judged too dangerous or too comfortable to allow inside. Then came the bath, shared by most surviving accounts among 2 or 3 strangers, using the exact same water before anyone thought to change it. Your own clothes were bundled up to be cleaned and fumigated, and in their place you were handed a coarse nightshirt and led to a cell, usually alone, sometimes barely wide enough to lie down in and locked in for the night. Supper, where it was offered at all, amounted to little more than a small piece of bread and a portion of thin gruel, echoing almost exactly the same rations we discussed earlier tonight, just with considerably less of it. Prayers were sometimes read aloud before lights out, and strict silence was enforced through the night, whether or not anyone in that cramped dormitory had the slightest interest in sleeping quietly beside a room full of complete strangers. The name itself, the Spike, likely traces back to something almost mundane. In several unions, the admission ticket a tramp received from the local police station was physically placed on a metal spike at the workhouse porter's desk, once handed over a small literal detail that apparently stuck hard enough in the collective memory of the road to become the name for the entire building. Other theories point instead to the sharpened tool used for picking apart old rope, since oakum was as common a task in the casual ward as anywhere else in this system. Either way, by the later decades of the century, tramps up and down the country were using the word without a second thought, the way we might casually reference any building by the thing everyone associates with it most. And there was always a task waiting on the other side of that locked door, because a night's shelter here was never simply given. It was earned specifically, deliberately, before you were allowed to leave. Men were typically set to breaking stone, roughly 200 in weight of it, hammered down, small enough to pass through an iron grille fitted into the cell window. The same grille that in some of the better preserved casual wards still standing today, visitors can see for themselves. Women more often were assigned oakum picking or scrubbing or laundry. Once the task was finished, and only once it was finished, you received a small ration of bread, and were shown back out the gate usually by mid-morning, which left you only half a day at best to walk toward wherever the next spike happened to be. Try to picture the arithmetic of that particular existence for a moment. Walk for hours, queue for hours more, work for hours after that, sleep for whatever handful of hours remained, and then the very next afternoon somewhere entirely new begin the exact same cycle all over again, with no end date written anywhere on the calendar. An act passed in 1871 tightened this arrangement further still, allowing unions to detain a vagrant until the task was properly complete, and if you happened to arrive on a Saturday, to hold you straight through the entire weekend before releasing you on Monday morning. The stated goal was breaking a pattern. Officials called the in-and-out habit tramps, drifting from one spike to the next, night after night doing the bare minimum of forced labour, in exchange for the barest minimum of shelter, never quite settling, never quite starving either. Whether the law actually solved that problem or simply made an already exhausting existence slightly more exhausting, is a question you can probably answer for yourself. Now I want to tell you about one particular night in one particular spike, because we happen to have an account of it, written by someone whose name you almost certainly already know, though probably not in this context. In the years just before he became famous as one of the most important writers of the 20th century, a young man named Eric Blair, writing under the name George Orwell, deliberately chose to live as a tramp for a stretch of time, sleeping rough, queuing for casual wards, experiencing this entire system firsthand rather than simply reading about it from a comfortable distance. He was not destitute in the way most of the men beside him were. He chose this life temporarily as a kind of immersive investigation, which makes what he recorded all the more valuable. A truly educated, observant mind describing this world from the inside, rather than reconstructing it second-hand from official reports and dry parliamentary testimony, the way most of tonight's story has necessarily had to. What he recorded from that experience remains even now one of the most vivid first-hand accounts we have of what this corner of the workhouse system actually felt like from the inside. He described waiting late one Saturday afternoon on a patch of grass outside a spike gate, alongside 48 other men and one woman, all of them too exhausted to talk much, smoking whatever scraps of tobacco they had managed to collect off the pavement, while blossoming branches swayed overhead, in what he clearly found an almost cruel kind of beauty, given the company keeping him there. Conversation among the group, when it happened at all, circled endlessly around the same handful of subjects: which spikes were tolerable, and which were not, which counties treated tramps decently and which did not, and a healthy, well-earned suspicion of both the police and certain charitable organisations. Have you ever noticed how people trapped in the exact same difficult circumstance tend to develop their own private shorthand for discussing it? Tramps, by Orwell's account, had turned that shorthand into practically their entire vocabulary, a whole conversational world narrowed down to survival, and very little else left over for anything resembling ordinary human curiosity. Because it happened to be a weekend Orwell and his companions were held over exactly the way that 1871 Act allowed, herded eventually into a bare, lime-washed dining room with windows set too high, to see anything through the only decoration a printed list of rules, warning of punishment for misbehaviour. He described the physical state of the men around him in unflinching detail. Bodies worn down by years of hunger and exposure, sunken chests, flat feet, sagging muscles, an elderly man in his 70s wearing a medical truss, eyes red and watering, looking in Orwell's own rather stark comparison like a figure risen from an old religious painting rather than a living person. He estimated privately that barely a handful of the men crowded into that room could honestly be called sound in body, and that perhaps half of them by rights belonged somewhere closer to a hospital bed than a workhouse dormitory. This was not exaggeration for literary effect. This was, quite simply, what decades of this system layered on top of an already difficult life had done to actual human bodies. Perhaps the detail from his account that has stayed with me longest, though, involves the kitchen rather than the dormitory. Orwell working briefly in the workhouse kitchen, that same visit watched as considerable amounts of good food, beef-bred vegetables, were deliberately thrown away rather than served to the hungry tramps waiting nearby, who were instead given nothing but bread, margarine and weak tea, with perhaps a boiled potato or two if it happened to be a Sunday. He filled several bins to overflowing with perfectly edible food that same afternoon, all of it destined for the rubbish heap rather than a single hungry stomach 200 yards away. When he asked a fellow tramp, a young man who travelled with his own books and held himself with a certain quiet dignity, why on earth the food was being wasted rather than shared, the answer he received was almost a perfect, unintentional summary of everything we discussed earlier tonight about the entire philosophy behind this system. Feed tramps too well, the man explained, and the spikes would fill up with people who preferred a comfortable bed to honest work. Nearly a full century after the principle of less eligibility was first written into law here, it was again still operating exactly as designed. Enforced now not by a poor law commissioner in London, but by ordinary kitchen staff quietly emptying good food into a dustbin rather than risk making a night's shelter feel like anything close to comfortable. It is a rather remarkable thing watching an idea outlive every single person who originally believed in it, still shaping decisions in kitchens and dining rooms decades after the men who wrote it down had long since died. Even inside that particular kind of despair, though, Orwell noticed small stubborn flickers of human dignity refusing to be entirely extinguished. Two of the men, given hard stale bread the following morning, impaled their rations on a spike in the yard in open protest before walking out a small, almost theatrical gesture of defiance that cost them nothing further to lose, since there was nothing further left to take from them. It reminds me honestly of those three women we met earlier tonight in Norwich, still finding the energy to be loudly, defiantly difficult, even after the system had taken nearly everything else. Resistance, it seems, does not always require the strength to actually win. Sometimes, it simply requires refusing to disappear quietly. Later on the road, a tramp who went by the name Scotty, grateful for a shared cigarette, pressed 4 salvaged cigarette butts into Orwell's hand. In return, a gift that valued honestly amounted to almost nothing at all, and yet in the context of two men who had nothing else whatsoever to give each other meant considerably more than that. I find myself thinking about that particular exchange more than almost anything else in Orwell's account. 4 scavenged cigarette ends given freely by a man who had every reason in the world to keep them for himself instead. What strikes me most about Orwell's account sitting with it now is how little had actually changed in nearly 100 years. The clothes were different. The century was different. The men swapping gossip on that patch of grass had never heard the words Poor Law, Amendment Act, and likely would not have cared much if they had. But the underlying logic comfort withheld deliberately hunger, managed rather than solved dignity, treated as something the poor had to keep proving they still deserved, traces in an almost unbroken line straight back to that committee room we sat in together, right at the very beginning of tonight's story. An idea, once it settles deeply enough into a system, apparently does not need anyone to keep actively believing in it anymore. It simply keeps running on its own generation after generation, long after the men who first wrote it down have been forgotten entirely. By the time Orwell wrote all of this down, this entire system, workhouses, spikes, casual wards, and everything we have walked through together tonight was already approaching the final years of its long, difficult life. But before we get to how it finally ended, there is one more place this story needs to take us considerably further from home than anywhere we have travelled tonight, because Britain was never the only country to look at poverty and decide the answer was a building with a locked gate. Cross the Atlantic with me for a moment, because the idea we have spent this entire night dissecting did not stay politely contained within one small island. It travelled the way ideas about controlling the poor so often seem to, wherever English settlers happened to go, carried across an ocean in the same ships that carried everything else these colonists considered essential to building a proper society. Boston built its own workhouse as early as 1660, a plain brick building intended in the language of the time for dissolute and vagrant persons, decades before the word workhouse had gathered anywhere near the grim weight it would eventually carry back in England. Other colonial towns followed the same instinct, borrowing directly from the English poor law tradition their own ancestors had left behind, because it turns out crossing an ocean rarely erases the assumptions a society carries about who deserves help and who simply needs to try harder. By the 1820s, reformers in cities like Boston were explicitly modelling their new institutions on the English workhouse, rather than the older, gentler almshouse tradition that had come before it. Josiah Quincy's House of Industry, built in that decade, borrowed its entire philosophy directly from across-the-ocean work as discipline, deprivation as deterrence. The exact same equation we spent our first stretch of tonight sitting inside. But here is where the story truly splits into something different, and I think the difference tells you almost as much as the similarity does. American law, built on constitutional protections against involuntary servitude, eventually made these institutions technically voluntary in a way the British system never quite managed. You could not be physically forced to remain inside, and by the later 19th century some officials complained openly that residents came and went essentially as they pleased, showing what one frustrated administrator called not the least respect for their betters. Have you ever noticed how the exact same starting idea planted in slightly different legal soil can grow into something recognizably related but meaningfully different? A single constitutional guarantee written for entirely unrelated reasons decades earlier ended up softening an institution nobody who wrote that guarantee had ever specifically imagined protecting. That is precisely what happened here, and it is worth pausing on because it suggests something rather hopeful about how legal frameworks once built for one purpose can end up quietly shielding people the original authors never pictured at all. It was not universally gentler, though, and I do not want to leave you with a falsely rosy picture since American poverty carried plenty of its own particular cruelties. Some American towns practice something called the poor auction, where responsibility for supporting a destitute resident was literally sold to whichever local farmer or tradesman would take them on for the lowest weekly fee from the town treasury, a system uncomfortably close to indentured servitude dressed up as municipal thrift, the poor person themselves reduced to a line item awarded to the cheapest bidder in the room. And yet alongside that we also have quieter, warmer stories like the Small Main Almshouse, a writer named Sarah Orne Jewett once described, where several elderly residents apparently chose to arrive each winter, not out of desperation exactly, but because it meant company through the cold months and one less heating bill to worry about a kind of seasonal voluntary companionship that would have been almost unthinkable inside the locked gate we walked through together at the very beginning of tonight. The same basic institution, born from the same basic anxiety about poverty, produced outcomes ranging from something close to a decent shared household to something barely distinguishable from being sold at auction, depending entirely on the town, the year, and the particular people running it, a variability we have, if you think back, noticed again and again throughout tonight's entire story on both sides of that ocean. Back in England, meanwhile, the system that started this entire story was already slowly running out of road. By the 1920s, workhouses had become in practice something quite different from what Chadwick and Nassau Sr. originally designed almost a century earlier. Roughly 8 out of every 10 people still living inside them were elderly, sick, or otherwise unable to work at all. Rather than the able-bodied poor, the entire system had been built specifically to deter. The very purpose that once justified every locked gate, every boneyard, every dietary chart calculated down to the ounce had quietly dissolved decades before the law itself finally caught up with that reality. A young health minister named Neville Chamberlain, a name you may recognise from an entirely different, considerably darker chapter of the 20th century still years away at this point, pushed the reforming legislation through Parliament in 1929, having spent the previous few years slowly dismantling the old boards of guardians one piece at a time. The Local Government Act finally abolished those boards outright, transferring their responsibilities to local county councils. Workhouses themselves were officially renamed Public Assistance Institutions, a wonderfully bureaucratic new label that fooled almost nobody. People kept right on calling them workhouses because renaming a building rarely changes what actually happens inside it, and old fears once learned by an entire community tend to outlast whatever fresh coat of paint gets applied to the sign out front. local guardians and councils in more than a few districts dragged their feet on making any real changes at all, which meant that for a great many inmates, the year 1930 went by looking remarkably similar to the year before it. Despite what the new paperwork in London claimed, the change, in other words, was legal long before it was real. As late as 1939, on the very eve of the Second World War, nearly 100,000 people were still living inside former workhouses across the country, more than 5,000 of them children still sleeping in buildings whose entire architecture had been designed a century earlier around principles of surveillance and deliberate deterrence. It would take almost another 2 full decades until the National Assistance Act of 1948, arriving alongside the birth of the National Health Service, that same year before the last legal remnants of the Poor Law finally formally disappeared, replaced by something recognisable as a modern welfare state. Help offered as a right rather than a punishment requiring an admission ticket and a locked gate. Even then, the buildings themselves rarely vanished. Many became care homes for the elderly, run now by local authorities, rather than boards of guardians, so thoroughly that by 1960 more than half of all local authority housing for older people in the entire country still stood inside former workhouse walls. Others became hospitals outright, the same infirmaries we spent time inside earlier tonight, absorbed directly into the newly formed National Health Service, quietly continuing to treat patients within brick walls, originally built to shame the very people they were now caring for, a strange kind of architectural redemption nobody in that original committee room could possibly have predicted. Camberwell Workhouse in South London almost unbelievably continued operating as a shelter for over 1,000 homeless men all the way until 1985, well within living memory for a great many people watching this video right now, which means somewhere out there, a person old enough to remember the 1980s might have walked past that exact building without ever knowing its full history. Which means, if you think about it for a moment, this is not quite as distant a story as it might feel from the comfort of wherever you are lying tonight. Somebody's grandmother may have spent her final years inside a converted workhouse and called it quite reasonably a perfectly nice care home, never once using the older word for what the building used to be. Somebody's local hospital may still, beneath decades of renovation, share its foundations with an infirmary where untrained pauper nurses once cared for 100 patients apiece. History like this rarely announces itself. It simply keeps standing, repainted, renamed, repurposed, waiting for someone curious enough to ask what the walls used to hold before anyone thought to ask them politely. I think that quiet persistence is worth sitting with for a moment, because it complicates the tidy ending. Most stories like this one are tempted to reach for. It would be comforting to say the system simply ended, that 1834 gave way cleanly to a modern, compassionate welfare state, and that the story closes there neatly like a book. The truth is considerably messier. Attitudes about who deserves help and who simply needs to try harder rarely disappear the moment a law changes. They tend to linger quietly in the language people use, in the assumptions built into new systems that replace the old ones, in the particular shame a person might still feel, filling out a form asking them to prove in writing exactly how poor they actually are. The gate closed. The instinct behind it, I suspect, never entirely did. We began tonight standing outside a locked iron gate, watching a stranger's entire identity get folded up, labelled, and placed on a shelf for safekeeping. We met the men in that London committee room who decided suffering could be engineered with precision so long as it stayed one careful notch below whatever misery already existed outside their windows. We walked through boneyards and dietary tables and dormitories where husbands and wives lived within shouting distance of each other for years, permitted only a glance across a chapel aisle. We watched entire families quietly dismantled on paper by category, by age, sometimes by an ocean crossing nobody back home had agreed to. We met Hugh Mundy, who simply refused to let an uncomfortable rumour go quietly, and in doing so helped bring down an entire unaccountable commission. We met Agnes Jones, who gave the last 3 years of her life to patients society had already written off as not worth the trouble. We met a small boy who would grow up to become one of the most beloved performers the world has ever produced, carrying a shaved, iodine-stained scalp and a punishment he had not deserved into everything he ever created afterward. We sat with women forced into yellow dresses and jacket-marked shame for a private failing no man beside them ever had to answer for. And we met George Orwell decades later, discovering that the exact same cold arithmetic was still quietly running the show, wearing slightly different clothes in a century that liked to imagine itself considerably more enlightened than the one before it. But for every name we managed to attach to this story tonight, there were thousands more who simply never made it into any surviving record at all. People whose entire lives amounted in the end to a single line on an admission ledger and nothing else. I think it matters that we said their names too, even without knowing what they were, even if all we could offer them tonight was the honest attention their own century so rarely bothered giving them while they were still alive to feel the absence of it. If there is one thread holding this entire night together, I think it is this. Systems built on the belief that suffering can be calibrated precisely made just uncomfortable enough to discourage the wrong people without quite crossing into outright cruelty rarely stay contained the way their architects intend. They spill. They catch the truly desperate, alongside the merely unlucky, the honestly disabled, alongside the supposedly idle, and they very often end up costing considerably more in money and in human beings than anyone in that original committee room ever bothered calculating. A theory that looks immaculate on paper, drawn up by men who will never personally test it, has an almost perfect track record of looking considerably less immaculate once it actually meets a hungry, exhausted, frightened human being standing on the wrong side of a locked gate. And perhaps that is the quiet lesson worth carrying with you out of tonight's story, long after the details of dietary charts and punishment books have faded a little. The measure of any system is rarely found in what its designers intended written calmly in some well-lit committee room. It is found in what actually happened to the people living underneath it, the ones history so rarely bothered naming, and the ones every so often brave or stubborn, or simply too honest to stay quiet who insisted on being seen anyway. Thank you honestly for spending this many hours of your night inside a history most people never think to ask about. If any part of tonight's journey stayed with you, that quiet ache somewhere in your chest is worth sitting with for a moment before you finally close your eyes. History like this deserves to be remembered by more than just the people who study it professionally, and simply by listening all the way to the end, tonight. You have already done a small part of that remembering yourself. Sleep well tonight in whatever bed you happen to be lucky enough to call your own, and when you're ready for the next story I will already be waiting here in the quiet with the lights low and another forgotten corner of history ready to be opened just for you.